Malcolm Crowe didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode his black horse straight through Evelyn Mercer's front gate at noon, three of his riders flanking him like shadows, and he didn't stop until the animal's chest was close enough to breathe on her face. Evelyn stood her ground on the porch steps, hands steady at her sides, though her heart was doing something violent behind her ribs. "I'll give you $400, Crowe said, like he was doing her a favor, like the number was generous, like the spring her husband had bled to find was worth exactly that much, and not 1 cent more. "The ranch isn't for sale," Evelyn said. Crowe smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing to do with anything pleasant. He leaned forward in his saddle and dropped a folded paper onto the dirt at her feet. "It will be," he said, "one way or the other." Then he turned his horse and rode out through her gate without closing it behind him, and somehow the open gate, the casual certainty that he'd be back, was the thing that frightened her most. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you don't want to miss what happens when a desperate widow hires the one man nobody in the territory dares to cross, subscribe and follow along. This one goes all the way to the end. The letter had come 3 weeks before Crowe rode through her gate, slipped under the door sometime in the night by hands Evelyn never saw. It wasn't long. Frontier men who meant real harm rarely wasted words. The spring belongs to the valley. The valley belongs to those who can hold it. You cannot hold it. Sell while the offer is still polite. She'd read it twice, then folded it into the back of the ledger she kept in her husband's old desk, behind the column of numbers that hadn't added up correctly in 8 months. She didn't throw it away. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because Daniel had taught her that paper was evidence, and evidence was the only weapon a woman without allies could afford to keep. Daniel Mercer had been dead for 11 months and 6 days. A riding accident, the county sheriff had told her, arriving at her door with his hat in his hands and an expression that managed to look sorry without actually being sorry. Daniel's horse had thrown him on the eastern slope, where the trail curved sharp above the dry creek bed. Tragic. These things happen. The frontier was unforgiving. Evelyn had thanked him, closed the door, and gone out to look at the eastern slope herself the following morning. She wasn't a tracker. She couldn't read ground the way experienced men could, but she could see that the trail was wide at the curve, not narrow. She could see that Daniel had ridden that particular stretch of land every single day for 9 years. And she could see, though she couldn't prove it, that the ground near the edge had been disturbed in a way that didn't match a spooked horse. She'd said nothing. She had no proof. She had no lawyer she could afford, no family within 300 miles, and no idea yet what Malcolm Crowe truly wanted from her. She learned that part slowly. The spring was the secret her land held that most people hadn't understood the value of until the drought hit in '83 and didn't let go. Most ranches in the territory ran on creek water and seasonal wells. When the creeks ran dry and the seasonal wells dropped below useful depth, those ranches started to bleed. Cattle died. Men sold out. Families that had worked land for a generation packed their belongings into wagons and moved on. The Mercer Spring didn't dry up. It came from somewhere deep in the mountain above her property, fed by an aquifer that the drought hadn't touched. Daniel had understood what that meant. He'd quietly helped 2 neighboring ranchers run pipelines across his land during the worst of it, not because he wanted anything in return, but because he said a valley that lost all its ranches was a valley that lost its soul. Malcolm Crowe had a different view of what the spring was worth. He saw it the way a man sees a locked room full of money, not as something to use wisely, but as something to own absolutely. Control the water, control the valley. It was the oldest equation in the West, older than statehood, older than law. He'd made his first offer to Daniel. Evelyn had later pieced together from conversations with her remaining hands. Daniel had said no, firmly and without much discussion. 2 months after that conversation, Daniel was dead at the bottom of the eastern slope, and now Crowe was working on the widow. Mess. By the time Crowe rode through her gate that noon, Evelyn had already lost 3 hired men. Not to violence, not directly. Carl Briggs had packed and left in the night without a word 2 months back. She'd found his bunk empty and his wages gone from the jar she kept on the kitchen shelf. Pete Garland had stayed longer. He was a stubborn man by nature. But after someone shot out the window above his bunk 3 nights running, he'd ridden into town for supplies and simply never come back. The third man, a quiet young hand named Doss, had come to her directly, hat in hand, and told her plainly that he had a mother in Santa Fe and didn't think he was going to live long enough to send her any more money if he stayed. She hadn't blamed any of them. She couldn't. That left her with 3. Thomas Griggs, who was 54 and had worked for Daniel since the beginning and said he intended to die on Mercer land if it came to that. His nephew Caleb, 19 years old and not quite as tough as he thought he was. And a weathered hand named Luce, who'd come up from the south 7 years ago and whose loyalty had never once wavered, though she'd never fully understood why. 3 men, 1 spring, 40,000 acres that meant nothing without water, and $400 from a man who was used to getting what he wanted. She went to town the morning after Crow's visit. Not because she had a plan. She went because the alternative was standing in Daniel's office, staring at numbers that didn't add up, and she'd done enough of that. Red Hook was the nearest town of any size, a single main street with a general store, a land office, a saloon that did more business than anything else, a doctor who drank too much, and a sheriff named Walt Pruitt, who had been very carefully not noticing things for the past several years. Evelyn didn't stop at the sheriff's office. She'd tried that twice already and come away with nothing but polite sympathy and the clear sense that Pruitt had already calculated which side of this conflict was safer for him personally. She stopped at the general store because she needed flour and because Josephine Aldred, who ran it with her husband Ned, had a talent for knowing things about people before those people introduced themselves. "You look like you haven't slept," Josephine said, weighing out flour without being asked. "I haven't much," Evelyn said. "Crow's men were in here yesterday." Josephine said it casually, like it was ordinary news. 2 of them, buying rope and wire. Seemed cheerful about it. Evelyn looked at her. "I'm just telling you what I saw," Josephine said. "A woman in your situation ought to know what's cheerful about." "I need more men," Evelyn said, more to herself than to Josephine. "Hands I can trust. Not boys looking for adventure. Not drifters who'll take the first week's pay and vanish. Men who'll actually stay." Josephine set the flour on the counter. She looked out through the store's front window toward the saloon across the street, then back at Evelyn. Something shifted slightly in her expression. "There's a man been sitting in the Crescent for about 4 days now," she said. "Quiet type. Doesn't drink much, which in that place is unusual. Doesn't talk to anybody, which is also unusual. He came in here 2 mornings ago for coffee beans and tobacco, paid fare, said please and thank you, and left." "Is he looking for work?" "I don't know what he's looking for. He might not know either." Josephine paused. "He has a particular kind of stillness to him. You'll know what I mean when you see it." Evelyn wasn't sure she trusted that kind of vague recommendation. She'd hired men on vague recommendations before and gotten vague results. But she was also 3 hands short, and the rope and wire Crow's men had bought cheerfully were going to be used for something. She crossed the street. The Crescent Saloon smelled like sawdust and spilled beer, and the particular staleness that came from a building that was never properly aired. It was late morning, too early for the evening crowd, and the main room held maybe 8 men scattered across tables, most of them doing the slow, quiet drinking that was less about pleasure than about something to do with their hands. She saw him immediately. He was at a corner table, which she noticed before she noticed anything else about him, the specific choice of positioning, back to the wall, angle that let him see every door and window without appearing to look at any of them. He was perhaps 35, lean in the way that came from years of hard use rather than deprivation, with dark hair gone slightly long at the collar and a jaw that hadn't met a razor in several days. His coat was worn but well kept. His hands rested on the table around a coffee cup, relaxed, but not loose. He was watching her cross the room before she'd taken 3 steps in from the door. Not in the way most men watched women walk into saloons. He wasn't sizing her up the way she was used to being sized up. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand, careful, without judgment, taking in information. She sat down across from him without asking. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said. "I own the Mercer Ranch, about 8 miles east. I need a ranch hand." He didn't say anything for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "How many head?" he said finally. His voice was lower than she'd expected and unhurried. 340 cattle, 40,000 acres, one working spring on the eastern quarter that every powerful man in the territory wants to get their hands on. "And you're here hiring?" "I'm 3 men down and I can't afford to be." He looked at her steadily. "What happened to the 3? 2 left. One was honest about why. He had a mother to think about. The other 2 I couldn't tell you for certain, but I have ideas. And you want to know if I'll do the same?" "I want to know if you're looking for work," she said. "That's the first question. The rest comes after." He was quiet for a stretch of time that would have been uncomfortable with most people. With him, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just time passing. 15 a month, she said. "Room, board, whatever work comes up. It won't always be cattle work." "What else will it be?" She met his eyes directly. "Staying." Something passed across his face that she couldn't identify. Not surprise, not amusement, something quieter. "What's your name?" she asked. "Rowan Hale." "Are you looking for work, Mr. Hale?" A pause. Then, "What time do you ride out?" She hadn't asked him about his past, and he hadn't offered any of it. That was a frontier arrangement that still held in 1884. A man's history was his own business, unless it became someone else's problem, and she figured she'd know soon enough if it became a problem. What she knew was that he'd ridden out with her that afternoon on a horse that was plain-looking and clearly exceptional, that he'd sat the saddle like a man who'd spent more of his life on horseback than off, and that he'd said perhaps 12 words on the 8-mile ride to the ranch. Thomas Griggs met them at the gate. He was a broad, gray-haired man with a face that had weathered into something close to stone, and he looked Rowan over with the particular scrutiny of someone who'd been evaluating men for several decades and had learned what the useful tells were. He didn't say anything right away. He walked around Rowan's horse, looked at the saddlebags, looked at the 2 revolvers holstered at Rowan's hips, not crossed, not theatrical, just there the way tools were there, and then looked at Rowan's face. "You done ranch work before?" he asked. "Some," Rowan said. "What else?" "Other things." Thomas looked at Evelyn. She gave him a small shrug that said, "This is what we have, so let's see." Thomas made a sound in his throat and walked back toward the barn. "He'll come around," Caleb said from where he'd been leaning against the fence, watching. He was grinning in the way 19-year-olds grin when they think they understand a situation better than the adults around them. "Uncle Thomas is like that with everybody at first. Took him 6 months to say a full sentence to me." Rowan looked at the boy. "How long have the riders been watching the North Ridge?" Caleb stopped grinning. "What?" Rowan tilted his head slightly in that direction without pointing. "There's been someone up there since at least an hour before noon. I picked them up about 3 miles out on the road in." Everyone looked north. The ridge was a long, rocky spine that ran above the ranch's upper pasture, rough country with good sight lines down to the main yard and the buildings. "I don't see anything," Caleb said, squinting. "No," Rowan agreed. He swung down from his horse. "You wouldn't, the way they're positioned." Evelyn looked at him. "You're certain?" "There's a spot just below the second outcropping where the shadow's wrong for this time of day. Something's up there that wasn't there yesterday." He said it without drama, just as information. "Has Crow's operation used that ridge before?" The question landed with a weight that told her he already knew the answer or close to it. "We don't know for certain it's Crow's men," she said carefully. "No," he said again, unbuckling his saddlebag. "But you don't know it isn't, He spent the rest of that afternoon walking, not working, not helping with anything useful, just walking the property with a quietness that Caleb found unnerving and that Thomas watched from a distance with an expression Evelyn couldn't read. Rowan walked the fence lines, the creek beds, the approaches to the barn, and the main house. He climbed the water tower at the north end of the yard and stood up there for a long time looking at things. At supper, he sat at the end of the table and ate without talking, and nobody talked much to him. After, when Caleb and Luce had gone to the bunkhouse and Thomas was smoking on the porch steps, Evelyn brought Rowan a cup of coffee and sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "What did you see today?" she asked. He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Someone's been studying this property for a while. Not just watching, studying. The approaches from the north and east have been used recently, not by cattle. Whoever's been out there knows which angles give them sight lines and which don't. He paused. There are two positions on the North Ridge and one on the eastern bluff that were purpose-chosen. Someone with military training or someone who learned from someone with military training. Evelyn set her coffee down. Grant Hollow, she said. Crow's enforcer. He served in the war. I don't know which side. Rowan nodded slowly like she'd confirmed something rather than told him something new. There's also a section of fence on the south pasture that's been cut and mended and cut again, he said. At least 3 times by my count. They're not trying to get cattle out. They're marking where they can come in fast if they want to. The room was quiet for a moment. How do you know all of this? She asked. He looked at her across the table. I've seen it done before. She waited. He didn't add anything to that. I hired you to help protect this ranch, she said. I'd like to know what I actually hired. Something moved behind his eyes. Not evasion, but something older than evasion. Like a door that had been closed for so long the hinges had stiffened. A man who knows how this kind of thing works, he said finally. That's enough for now. She should have pushed. She knew it, and she didn't push anyway, partly because she was tired, and partly because something in the way he'd read her land in a single afternoon had told her more than any biography could have. What do we do about the fence sections? She said. Leave them for now. If we patch them, whoever's watching knows we've noticed. Better they think we haven't. And the men on the ridge? Same. He picked up his coffee. I want them to think this is still an easy target. Yep. 3 nights later, Grant Hollow came to call. He didn't come the way Crow came, on horseback in the daylight, like a man confident in his authority. Hollow came at dusk, alone, tied his horse a 1/4 mile up the road, and walked to the front porch like he was just a man taking an evening stroll. He was built like a barn door and moved like a man who'd never once been afraid of another person, and he wore that certainty the way some men wore their hats, without thinking about it. Evelyn was on the porch when he came up the path. She saw him before he reached the gate and had the presence of mind not to look toward the barn, where she knew Rowan was working, and where she knew Rowan had almost certainly seen Hollow coming before she had. Mrs. Mercer, Hollow said, touching the brim of his hat without removing it. The gesture managed to be both formal and contemptuous at the same time. Mr. Hollow. She kept her voice level. He leaned against the gatepost. Mr. Crow wanted me to check in. Make sure you'd had time to think over his offer. I have, she said. The answer is still no. Hollow looked around the yard with the slow, measuring gaze of a man calculating distances. His eyes moved to the barn, to the bunkhouse, to the water tower. Professional assessment. He was counting. I heard you took on a new man, he said. I've taken on several new men, she said, which was not true, but came out evenly. Hollow looked back at her. He had flat, pale eyes, the color of winter sky over rock, and they held nothing in them that could be mistaken for warmth. New man you brought in from town, sitting in the crescent for a few days first. That one. She said nothing. You ought to be careful who you pick up off a barroom floor, Hollow said. Drifters don't stay, especially when things get difficult. He smiled, a thin and practiced expression. And things are going to get difficult, Mrs. Mercer. Mr. Crow is a patient man, but he's not an eternal one. 30 days, she said, quoting the figure back at him. That's what his letter said. His last letter, Hollow agreed. The next communication may not be written. A silence stretched between them. From somewhere in the barn, there was the sound of a saddle being moved, a soft scrape of leather on wood. Nothing dramatic, just the ordinary sound of a man working. Hollow heard it. His eyes moved to the barn door. How many hands you running now? He asked, more carefully this time. Enough, she said. He looked at the barn for a moment longer, then back at her. Something had shifted in his posture, slightly, not much, the difference between a man completely comfortable and a man who has encountered one small piece of information he hadn't accounted for. 30 days, he said again, and touched his hat brim and walked back down the path. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched him go and did not move until she couldn't see him anymore. He was counting, said Rowan's voice from just inside the front door behind her. She startled, turned. He was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, looking out past her at the empty road. I didn't hear you come around, she said. I know. He pushed off the frame. He was counting how many men, where they were positioned, how quickly they could respond. He'll report back what he found. And what will he report? Rowan almost smiled, not quite, but close. That he's not entirely sure, he said, and that he doesn't like not being sure. She turned that over. Is that good or bad? It buys time, he said. What we do with the time is the question. Check. The next morning, Rowan started making changes to the ranch, and none of them looked like what they were. He asked Thomas for wire and spent 2 hours running it low and almost invisible through the dry creek bed that ran along the north pasture's edge. Not fence wire, just thin signal wire, strung at ankle height for a horse, connected to nothing visible from a distance, but which would, if tripped in the dark, cause a series of empty tin cans to rattle against the inside of the barn wall. Alarm system, Thomas said, watching. Something like that. For night riders. For anyone moving fast in the dark who thinks they know the ground. Thomas picked up the end of a wire and turned it in his fingers. He'd been in the war, the actual war, not Grant Hollow's war, the real one with its rivers of blood and its long silences after. He recognized the logic of what Rowan was doing, not because he'd been an officer who thought about tactics, but because he'd been a private who'd survived men who did. "You done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Rowan said. "Where?" "Different places." Thomas set the wire down. He worked in silence beside Rowan for the rest of the morning, and somewhere in the middle of that work, something between them settled into a different shape. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular understanding that develops between men who approach a problem the same way. Caleb was less settled. He watched Rowan string wire and map the property and position himself each evening before dark with what he called his evening smoke, but which Evelyn suspected was actually a methodical visual check of the perimeter, and the boy's admiration fought openly with his pride. "He doesn't explain anything," Caleb said to Evelyn in the kitchen one evening. "Neither did you when you first came," she said. "I'm 19. He's—" Caleb gestured vaguely. "He's different." "Yes," she agreed. "It's like he's always listening to something we can't hear," Caleb said. Evelyn looked out the kitchen window toward where Rowan was standing at the edge of the yard, looking at nothing in particular in the way she'd started to recognize as him looking at everything. "Maybe he is," she said. The letter from the land syndicate arrived 12 days after Rowan came to the ranch. It came through the mail, which made it feel official. And it was official. Printed on proper legal stationery from a firm in Santa Fe called Hargrove, Keel and Associates, which she'd never heard of. It informed her in formal language that a review of territorial land surveys had uncovered a discrepancy in the original deed for the Mercer water rights, and that pending investigation, all water usage from the spring on the eastern quarter of her property was subject to dispute. She read it standing at the kitchen table, and her hands were steady, but her face felt cold. Thomas read it after her and used a word that she pretended not to hear. Luce read it and was quiet for a long time and then said, "This is not the county. This is bigger than the county." She gave it to Rowan last. He read it twice, slowly, and then set it on the table face down. "How long did your husband own this land?" he asked. "We bought it together 9 years ago," she said. "The original deed was clean. I've looked at it 100 times. Do you have the survey records, the original ones, from when the property was first mapped?" "Yes. Daniel kept everything." She paused. "He was a careful man." Rowan looked at her. "Can I see them?" She unlocked Daniel's office for the first time since she'd gone looking for evidence of how he'd died, and she stood in the doorway while Rowan sat at the desk and spread the survey papers out and went through them with a patience that was almost painful to watch. An hour passed, then another. "This is a forgery," he said finally, holding up one page. She came into the room. "Which one?" "The 1879 resurvey." He laid it next to the original 1874 survey. He pointed to 2 specific notations, coordinate markings that differed between documents in a way that appeared technical and minor, but that, in the language of territorial land law, shifted the boundary of the water rights by enough to exclude the spring. Someone changed these numbers after the fact. The paper's different. This one's newer. And the notary stamp on the resurvey is from a notary named Caldwell. Does that name mean anything to you? She stared at the two papers. "There's a Caldwell in the county land office," she said slowly. "Elias Caldwell. Who does Crow know in the county land office?" The room was quiet. "Everyone?" she said. Rowan sat back in the chair and looked at the papers spread across Daniel's desk. In the lamplight, he looked older than 35, or maybe it was something behind his eyes rather than in them, something that had seen more of how the world worked than a man should have to by that age. "Your husband didn't die in a riding accident," Rowan said. Not as a question, as a fact being stated in the open for the first time. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe. "No," she said. "I don't think he did." "And he'd found this." She looked at the resurvey document. "He'd been in the land office 3 times in the month before he died. I know because he mentioned it, and I didn't ask why, because he was like that. He'd work a problem out all the way before he told me about it." She stopped. "I've regretted not asking every day since." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Daniel Mercer," he said, half to himself. That was his name. "You didn't know him?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the desk, at the careful organization of papers and ledgers, at the inkwell still sitting in its corner like Daniel had just stepped out for 5 minutes. "He was a careful man," Rowan said again, echoing her own words back at her. "Did you know him?" she asked again, differently this time. The lamplight moved. Somewhere outside, the wind came up and pushed at the windows. "I knew a Daniel Mercer once," he said, "a long time ago, in a different place." He picked up the forged resurvey document and held it to the lamp. "If it's the same man, then I owe him more than $15 a month." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the room held that weight between them like a third person standing there. "What do we do with this?" she said finally, meaning the document. "We find the original surveyor," Rowan said. "Not Caldwell, the man who did the 1874 survey. He'll still have his field notes. Field notes don't get forged because most people don't know they exist." He set the paper down. "And we need to do it quietly, before anyone decides we've gotten too close to the truth to leave alone." Outside, the tin cans in the barn didn't rattle, but the night felt tighter than it had before, like something was being wound slowly toward a point of no return. And Evelyn Mercer stood in her dead husband's office and understood, for the first time since she'd buried him, that she was not going to lose this land. She was going to have to fight for it in ways she hadn't imagined yet. And the quiet man sitting at Daniel's desk, turning forged documents in the lamplight with steady hands and careful eyes, was not quite what he had told her he was. She was going to have to reckon with that too, but not tonight. Tonight she stood in the doorway and let the understanding settle, that some problems were shaped like land disputes, but were actually something older and more personal, and that the man she'd found sitting in a corner of the Crescent Saloon with empty eyes and a full coffee cup had maybe not been waiting for work at all. Maybe he'd been waiting for this specific knock on this specific door. She didn't ask. The frontier had always run on questions better left for later. The original surveyor's name was Amos Kettle, and finding him turned out to be the kind of problem that looked simple until you started pulling at it. Evelyn knew the name from the original 1874 deed paperwork, a small notation in the lower corner of the survey map, handwritten in a tight, careful script. A. Kettle, licensed surveyor, territory of New Mexico. She'd looked at it dozens of times without thinking much about it, the way you look at the signature on a painting without wondering where the painter ended up. Now the name felt like the only solid thing in the room. "He worked out of Red Hook," she said, going through Daniel's files the morning after their discovery, pulling papers from the lower drawer where Daniel had kept the oldest records. "At least he did in 74. There was a surveying office on the south end of Main Street. I remember the sign, but I don't think I ever saw anyone in it." "Do you know if it's still there?" Rowan asked. "I don't know if he's still alive." That was the first problem. Rowan rode into Red Hook alone that morning, which was his preference and which she didn't argue with, and came back 3 hours later with the answer. The surveying office was now a harness shop, had been for 4 years, and the man who ran it had never heard of Amos Kettle. The previous owner before him had been a woman who'd sold the building to settle a debt and moved north. The trail went sideways fast. "He's not dead," Rowan said, unsaddling his horse in the barn while she stood in the doorway. There's no record of it in the county register. Josephine Aldred at the general store remembers him, said he left Red Hook around 1880, said he was heading to live with a daughter in a town called Mineral Springs, about 40 miles southeast. Did she know if he actually got there? She thinks so. She said a man who knew him mentioned seeing Kettle there about 2 years ago. Evelyn did the arithmetic in her head. The forged resurvey was dated 1879. Kettle had left the area in 1880. The timing was not comfortable. He left because someone pushed him out, she said. That's possible. Or because he found out what they'd done with his name and was afraid. Rowan looked at her. Also possible. Which one do you think? He was quiet for a moment, hanging up the bridle. A man with field notes he's kept for 6 years doesn't usually run unless he has a reason to keep them somewhere safe. He turned around. I think he found out, and I think he left because staying was dangerous, but he didn't destroy the notes because some part of him knew they'd matter eventually. She wanted to believe that. She recognized that wanting to believe it was its own kind of risk. One of us needs to go to Mineral Springs, she said. I'll go. I need you here. He looked at her steadily. You need the field notes more. She didn't have a good answer to that, which meant he was right. Which annoyed her in the way being right about difficult things always annoyed people who were trying to manage more variables than they had hands for. Thomas can handle the watch while I'm gone, Rowan said. 2 days? Maybe 3? I'll be back before the end of the week. And if Hollow makes a move while you're away? Then Thomas knows what to do. He paused. I showed him the wire lines yesterday. He knows which positions to hold if it comes to it. She studied his face. You told Thomas, but you didn't tell me. I told you this morning that I'd walk the perimeter with him. You didn't tell me what you showed him. He seemed to consider that, not defensively, just considering it, the way he considered most things, carefully and without flinching from the weight of it. You're right, he said. I'll tell you everything before I leave. She hadn't expected that answer, and it threw her off balance for a second. She'd been prepared to argue, and he'd simply agreed, which left her standing in the barn doorway with her argument still loaded and nowhere to aim it. Tonight, then, she said. Tonight, he agreed. He spent the afternoon working, actually working, mending the section of south fence that had been cut and remended so many times it was more patched than original, because leaving it wrong any longer would start to look deliberate in the wrong direction. Caleb worked alongside him and made 3 attempts at conversation that all met the same wall of minimal response, and by the 4th attempt he'd shifted strategy and started talking without expecting answers, which seemed to suit Rowan better. My uncle thinks you were a soldier, Caleb said, driving a fence post while Rowan stretched wire. Lots of men were soldiers, Rowan said. He said it's not that. He said it's the way you look at ground. He said soldiers look at ground different from regular men. They're always thinking about who's hiding in it. Rowan wrapped wire around the post. Your uncle's observant. He said you're not just looking for who's hiding. He said you're thinking about where you'd put someone if you were the one hiding them. Caleb stopped driving and looked at him. Is that true? When you're fixing fence on the south pasture, Rowan said, without looking up from the wire, where's the first place you look when you hear something you don't recognize? Caleb thought about it. The tree line up by the ridge. Why? Because that's where I'd go if I didn't want to be seen from the yard. Rowan looked at him then. That's what your uncle means, he said. You've been doing it too. You just haven't noticed yet. Caleb went back to driving the post, but he was quiet for a while after that in a different way than before. Not the quiet of someone who'd given up on conversation, but the quiet of someone actually thinking. Luz rode the east pasture line in the afternoon and came back at dusk without any news, which was either good or meant that whoever was watching had gotten better at not being seen. Evelyn cooked, which was one of the few things she did purely because it required her hands and gave her mind room to work separately from her body. She'd been doing her best thinking at the stove for as long as she could remember. Daniel had teased her about it. You make coffee when you're worried and you make supper when you're planning something, he'd said once, coming in from the barn to find her in front of a full pot at 3 p.m. Which is it tonight? Both, she'd told him. He'd sat down at the table and waited without another word, which was one of the things she'd loved most about him. She didn't realize she was crying until a drop hit the back of her hand on the cast iron, and she wiped her face quickly and didn't turn around in case anyone had come in. Nobody had. The kitchen was empty. She stood there for a moment with her hands on the stove and let it pass, because grief didn't go away faster if you held it tighter. She'd learned that the hard way. And then she went back to cooking. Tut. After supper, true to his word, Rowan laid everything out for her at the kitchen table. He drew the ranch in rough lines on the back of an old flour sack, not artistic, but accurate, and marked the alarm wire positions, the elevated sight lines, the cut fence sections he'd left deliberately unrepaired, the two approaches from the north ridge that Crow's watchers had been using. He marked the water tower as a secondary position. He marked the barn as the strongest defensive structure on the property, if it came to that. If riders come at night, he said, they'll most likely split into 3 groups, north, east, and a smaller group from the south to cut off the road. Standard approach for this kind of property. They'll want to move fast and have it finished before anyone can get to town for help. She looked at the flour sack. And our 3 men stop this how? They don't stop it, he said. They change what it costs. He pointed to the north approach. The wire in the creek bed slows the first group, horses in the dark hitting an unexpected line. They go sideways, riders come off or pull up hard. That's noise and confusion where they wanted silence and speed. Thomas takes the water tower. He moved his finger to the east. Caleb covers the barn door, loose on the south fence with a rifle. And me? You stay in the house with the documents. She looked up from the flour sack. No. The documents are what this is about. I am not going to sit in the house while 3 men and you. She stopped. 4 people hold off however many Crow sends. 5 people can't hold a 40-acre ranch yard against 15 riders, he said flatly. 3 people in the right positions buy time. Time is the goal, not winning a fight. Time for what? For someone to have already ridden to town before the attack starts. He looked at her. That's the 5th role. Not defending, riding. The moment the alarm wire goes, whoever's on the south road goes for Red Hook. She stared at him. You want me to run? I want you to ride hard and fast and get far enough away that whatever happens here isn't the end of the story. His voice was even, but there was something in it that wasn't quite even, a pressure underneath, controlled. The documents in that desk are copies. I made copies this morning, and I want you to take them with you when you ride. She hadn't known he'd made copies. She looked at him differently for a second. When did you? Early this morning, before you were up. She thought about being irritated by that and decided it wasn't worth the energy. You're expecting an attack. I think Hollow knows we found something in that office, he said. He won't know exactly what we found, but he'll know we've been in there, because the watchers on the ridge have been watching the house, not just the yard. And he'll know I went to Red Hook this morning, and he'll be trying to figure out why. He folded the flour sack map and slid it across the table to her. We have maybe 4 or 5 days before they decide to stop waiting and force the issue. Is that why you're going to Mineral Springs now, before the 4 or 5 days are up? He met her eyes. Yes. The lamp between them threw their shadows up the wall, and the room was very quiet, and she thought about Daniel sitting at this table, in this light, with his careful hands and his careful mind, and the way he'd always seemed to know more than he said until the moment he chose to say it. You're a lot like him, she said, before she'd decided to say it. Rowan was quiet. Daniel, she said, you have the same... She couldn't find the right word. The same way of being in a room, like you're thinking 2 things at once and only one of them is the thing you're talking about. He looked down at the table. Something in his face shifted in a way she couldn't track. Tell me how you knew him, she said. A long pause. The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window. I was in a bad place, he said, slowly, like he was picking each word from a pile and checking it for weight before using it. About 7 years ago, east of here. I was in the kind of situation where most people would have looked the other way, and Daniel Mercer didn't look the other way. He stopped. He didn't know me. He didn't know anything about me except that I needed help, and he had the capacity to give it. So he did. She waited. He never asked for anything back, Rowan said. Wouldn't take money, just said... He paused again. Said something about how a valley that loses its ranches loses its soul. The words hit her like a hand on the shoulder. She recognized them immediately. They were Daniel's words exactly, the same ones she'd heard him say a dozen times in different conversations. She had to look away for a moment at the window. He talked about his ranch, Rowan said, talked about the spring and the valley and a wife who understood things better than he did. He wasn't a man who needed to make himself sound important. He just talked like a man who knew what he had and was grateful for it. She turned back. I looked for him once, Rowan said, about 4 years ago. I'd been away, out of contact. When I came back through this part of the territory and tried to find him, I got told he'd had an accident. Who told you? Man in Red Hook. Didn't know much else? His jaw tightened slightly. I moved on. I shouldn't have moved on. The weight of that settled on the table between them. She didn't try to take it off him because some weight was earned honestly, and removing it without permission was its own kind of trespass. You didn't know, she said. No, he said. But I do now. He left before dawn the next morning, and the ranch felt different with him gone. Not worse exactly, but more exposed. The way a room feels larger when the person who fills it most fully has stepped out. Evelyn noticed it and told herself not to notice it, which was only partially successful. Thomas noticed too, in his way. He was quieter than usual at breakfast, ate fast, and went out to check the wire lines in the creek bed before the sun was fully up. He told you where everything is? She asked him when he came back. He told me, Thomas said. You think I need to use it? I hope not. Hoping's for churches, Thomas said, which was close to the most words he'd put together in a week. I'll be on the tower tonight. Caleb tried to act like everything was normal, which was its own kind of tell. He was a boy who went quiet when he was nervous and loud when he was trying to cover it. He spent the morning being loud about nothing in particular and then went quiet around noon and stayed that way. Luce said nothing, as was his custom, but he cleaned his rifle twice in one afternoon, which he'd never done in Evelyn's memory. She kept herself moving. There was always work on a ranch, work that didn't care about politics or forged surveys or men with flat pale eyes and cheerful rope purchases. She mended harness. She went through the feed calculations for the month. She checked on the spring itself, climbing the path to the eastern quarter and standing at the lip of the stone basin where the water came up cold and clear from whatever deep place it lived, thinking about Daniel finding this spot and knowing what it meant. He'd been so excited. She could still hear it, not his voice exactly, but the shape of it, the particular animation that came over him when he'd worked something out. Evie, come look at this. Come look what's here. She put her hand in the water. It was very cold. She thought, this is worth fighting for. Not because of the money, not even because of the cattle, because he found it and because he would have used it well, and because the people trying to take it would use it the exact opposite of well. She pulled her hand out and went back down the path. It was the second night without Rowan that things went sideways, not the attack. That wasn't the second night, as it turned out. What happened the second night was smaller and more immediately personal, and in some ways more frightening for it. Caleb was on the south fence on watch when she heard him shout, not a scream, just a sharp, startled shout, and she was out the back door with the shotgun before she'd fully processed what the sound meant. Thomas came down from the water tower faster than she'd thought a man his age could move. Luce was already running across the yard from the bunkhouse. Caleb was standing at the south fence line, and he was fine, physically fine, standing with his rifle up pointed at the dark, and when they got to him, he lowered it, and his face was white. Someone was out there, he said. Where? Thomas said. Just past the fence. I heard something. I thought it was cattle, but the sound was wrong for cattle, and then He stopped. There was a man, standing just past the fence line, not moving, just standing. Did he say anything? Evelyn asked. No. Caleb's voice was steady, but thin. He just stood there and looked at me, for maybe 30 seconds. Then he walked back into the dark. Thomas took the rifle from him without asking and went to the fence, stepped through, walked 20 feet into the dark without a lamp. He came back a minute later and handed Caleb the rifle. Boot prints, he said. One man. He wasn't trying to be quiet coming in. He wanted to be seen. Evelyn understood that immediately, and the understanding was cold. It wasn't reconnaissance, it was pressure. It was Hollow, or someone working for Hollow, sending a message that they could stand at the edge of her property at night, and there wasn't anything she could do about it. It was designed to make her hands shaky, and her sleep short, and her judgment cloudy. "Go back to your posts," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. She went back inside and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a few minutes. Not panicking, she wasn't prone to panic, and the months since Daniel's death had burned away whatever remained of that reflex. But feeling the weight of what patience under sustained pressure actually cost. It cost sleep, and it cost clarity, and it cost the small interior room where a person kept their sense of safety. Hers was getting very small. She lit the lamp and opened the flour sack map Rowan had given her and looked at it until the positions stopped being drawings and started being the actual land she knew. Then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her coat where she could reach it fast if she needed to. Rowan came back on the third day, which was a day earlier than expected, and he came back with a man. Amos Kettle was 71 years old and looked like someone had taken a person and left him out in the elements for several decades with the intention of seeing what was still there at the end. He was thin and slightly stooped and wore a hat that had been resoled at least twice, and his eyes behind thick spectacles were sharp in a way that the rest of him wasn't, the eyes of a man whose mind had stayed considerably younger than his body. He also, tucked inside a leather document case worn soft with age, had his original 1874 field notes for the Mercer property survey. He handed them to Evelyn in the kitchen without ceremony, like a man paying a bill he'd been carrying too long. "I've been expecting someone to come find me," he said, sitting down at the table and accepting the coffee she poured him with both hands, the way old men who live alone accept warmth. "Didn't know it would take this long." "You know what was done with your survey," she said. "I know what they tried to do with it," he said. "I know because a man came to see me in 1879, called himself an agent for a land syndicate, and asked me to alter my records. Said it was a simple correction, said the original markings had been done in error." He took a sip of coffee. "I told him to get out of my office." "And then?" "And then my office was broken into 3 days later. Nothing taken except my file copy of the Mercer survey." He set the cup down. "Which is why I still have the field notes, because they were in my coat pocket that day, not in the office. A man's field notes are in his coat pocket. Always. That's just the way of it." "Why didn't you report it?" He looked at her with those sharp eyes. "I went to the county land office. Elias Caldwell told me I must be mistaken and offered me a glass of water." A pause. "So then I knew how far it went. And I'm an old man with a daughter in Mineral Springs, Mrs. Mercer, and I made a choice I've been ashamed of since." Evelyn looked at the field notes on the table between them. The paper was old but sound, the notations clear, the coordinate numbers unmistakable, and incompatible with the numbers in the forged resurvey. Any surveyor worth his license would see it immediately. "Are you willing to sign a sworn statement?" she said. Kettle looked at Rowan, then back at her. "That's why I came." "They'll know," she said. "Once you sign, they'll know we have the evidence." "I know that," Kettle said. "I'm 71 years old, Mrs. Mercer. I've been carrying this for 6 years. I'd rather whatever happens to me happens to a man who finally did the right thing than to a man who didn't." He took another sip of coffee. "Your husband deserved better than what he got. I knew him a little. He was a fair man." The kitchen was quiet. "He was," Evelyn said. She poured more coffee without being asked, and nobody said anything for a minute, and the old surveyor sat with his hands around the cup and looked out the window at the ranch in the late afternoon light. They drove into Red Hook the next morning, all 5 of them, Evelyn and Rowan and Amos Kettle in the wagon, Thomas and Luz riding alongside. Caleb left back at the ranch because someone had to be there, and because Evelyn wasn't willing to leave the property empty. She thought hard about where to go with the statement. Not the county land office, Caldwell. Not Sheriff Pruitt. She'd lost whatever thin faith she'd had there 2 conversations ago. Josephine Aldred had suggested, quietly and without being asked, that a federal land commissioner had been working out of the town of Garrison, 40 miles north, and that his office had a reputation for operating outside the county's particular arrangement of interests. That was the long play. But they needed something that would hold against an immediate move, which meant they needed the sworn statement recorded locally first, witnessed by someone with standing, and that meant going to the one person in Red Hook who Evelyn knew had no relationship with Malcolm Crowe. Dr. Edwin Marsh, who drank too much, and knew it, and was bitter about many things, but who had a notary's certification from 1871, and who had, to her knowledge, never in his life done a favor for anyone he didn't believe deserved it. Marsh agreed to witness without much persuasion. He read the statement Rowan had helped Kettle draft the night before, read the field notes, looked at the forged resurvey copy they'd brought alongside, and said, in the specific register of a man making a clinical observation, "This is fraud, obviously." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Caldwell's involved." "Almost certainly." "And Crowe." "Yes." Marsh looked at her over his spectacles. "You know this is going to get loud." "It's already loud," she said. "I'd just like the record to reflect the truth of it before it gets any louder." He notarized the statement, made 3 copies, signed and dated all of them, and handed them to Evelyn with the particular expression of a man who has just done something he doesn't expect to be thanked for properly. "Keep one here," Rowan said to her quietly, "and I'll take one to Garrison myself." "When?" "Tomorrow." He looked at her. "We don't have much time. By tonight, Hollow will know we were in town. By tomorrow morning, he'll know we went to Marsh. He won't know what we brought and what we did, but he'll be guessing, and desperate men who guess wrong make violent decisions." They were standing on the street outside Marsh's office, and the afternoon was cooling into the particular dry chill of a New Mexico autumn, the sky going that deep color that only happened this time of year, and the town around them was ordinary and busy and indifferent in the way towns are when they don't know what's moving through them. She looked at him. "How long before they come?" He was quiet for a moment. "They were watching us ride into town," he said. "They'll be watching us ride out." He looked up the street toward where Thomas and Luce had the wagon waiting. "We go home, we eat supper, we put everyone on watch, and I ride for Garrison before first light tomorrow. And while you're gone," he looked back at her. Something in his face was different from the expression he'd worn that first day in the Crescent Saloon, still controlled, still that particular stillness, but under it something that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly. Something more functional than warmth. Something that came from having worked alongside people and decided they were worth the risk. "While I'm gone," he said, "you hold the line." She held his gaze for a moment. "I've been holding it for 11 months, she said. "I know," he said. "You're still here." She turned and walked toward the wagon, and he fell into step beside her, and neither of them said anything else. And the town moved around them ordinary and busy, and carrying no idea of what was building at its edges. The evidence in her coat pocket, and the forged document in his saddlebag, and the 40 miles of hard road to Garrison, and the riders that would come before any of it was resolved, because men like Malcolm Crowe didn't wait for the legal system to catch up with them when they had the alternative of making sure it never got the chance. The tin cans on the barn wall were still quiet when they got home. They stayed quiet through supper, through the long watch of the evening, through the first hours of the night, but the wire in the creek bed was taut and waiting, and somewhere on the north ridge a shadow moved against the dark in a way that wasn't wind, and Evelyn Mercer lay in her bed with the sworn statement folded against her chest and didn't sleep and knew that the quiet was not peace. It was the particular silence of things about to break. Rowan left before the sky was anything more than a dark gray suggestion of morning, saddling his horse in silence while the ranch was still, and the watchfire at the water tower burned low with Thomas somewhere above it, awake and waiting for a sun that was taking its time. Evelyn was already up. She hadn't slept enough to call it sleeping, more like a long negotiation with wakefulness that she'd lost by 3 in the morning and given up pretending to win by 4. She was in the yard when he brought his horse out of the barn, the sworn statement copy folded into his saddlebag, alongside the field notes Kettle had left them and the forged resurvey document they'd need to lay beside them for comparison. "Garrison's 40 miles, she said. "I know." "The land commissioner. His name is Aldous Webb. Josephine's husband Ned did a property filing with him 2 years ago, said he was difficult but straight." "Difficult is fine," Rowan said, checking the cinch on his saddle. "If you're not back by nightfall tomorrow." "I'll be back by nightfall tomorrow," I'm telling you what to do if you're not, she said, and he stopped adjusting the cinch and looked at her. If you're not back, Thomas knows to ride south to the Garrett Ranch. Walt Garrett, he's decent. He's had his own trouble with Crow's fencing games. He'll ride with Thomas to Garrison if it comes to that. The second copy of the statement is in the left side of the desk, behind the survey records. Rowan was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this. I've been awake since 3, she said. I had time. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The expression of a man who recognizes competence in another person and doesn't know quite what to do with his respect for it. Don't let Caleb do anything that can't be undone, he said. He's 19. Everything he does can be undone. Not everything, Rowan said, and there was enough weight in it that she didn't argue the point. He mounted, settled himself in the saddle with that particular ease that she'd stopped noticing because it had become ordinary, and looked down at her in the gray pre-dawn. Hold the line, he said. You said that yesterday. It was true yesterday, too. He rode out through the gate, and she watched him until the dark took him, and then she went inside and put the coffee on and sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. The day passed the way days pass when you're waiting for something you can't control, slowly and full of small tasks that don't add up to the actual thing you need to be doing. She checked on the cattle in the north pasture. She repaired a hinge on the smokehouse door that had been wrong for a month. She went over the ledger again, not because anything had changed in it, but because running numbers gave her hands something to do while her mind worked at the other problems separately. Caleb was restless in the visible, physical way of young men who've been told to stay put, pacing the yard, finding small things to fix that didn't need fixing, checking his rifle twice in the afternoon, and then appearing embarrassed that she'd seen him do it. He'll be fine, she said, meaning Rowan. I know, Caleb said, in the voice of someone who wasn't sure. He knows what he's doing. I know that too. Caleb leaned against the fence post. It's not him I'm worried about. She looked at him. There were 4 men on the North Ridge last night, he said. I counted from the water tower around midnight, when the moon came up enough to see. 4. That's more than before. She hadn't known that. She'd been in the house, not on watch. Did you tell Thomas? He already knew. He didn't want to wake you. She made a mental note to have a conversation with Thomas about what she did and didn't need to be woken for, and then she let it go because Thomas was Thomas and had been making those calls since before she arrived on this land. 4 men watching is more than one man's operation, she said. Crow's committed resources. Yes, ma'am. That means he's not bluffing anymore. Caleb looked at the ground. No, ma'am. She straightened up from the fence. Good. Then we know where we stand. Make sure your rifle's cleaned and loaded by dark. And eat something. You haven't eaten properly since this morning. He looked at her like he wanted to say something and then thought better of it. What? She said. Nothing. A pause. I was just thinking that when I hired on here, I thought I'd be doing cattle work. You are doing cattle work, she said. You're just also doing other things. He almost laughed. Almost. She counted it as a partial victory. Luce came to her at dusk with something in his expression that she'd learned to read as significant, because Luce didn't come to her with things unless they were significant. He was that kind of man, economy of motion, economy of words, and when something broke through that economy, it meant something. Rider coming from the South Road, he said, alone, moving slow. Not Crow's approach. Crow didn't send one rider moving slow. This was something else. She went to the gate with Luce behind her and Thomas coming down from the tower and Caleb appearing from the barn doorway with his hand near his rifle. The rider was a woman. She was perhaps 50, solidly built, riding a bay mare with the confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time on horseback, and she wore a canvas duster and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen real weather. She pulled up at the gate and looked at them all with dark, direct eyes. Evelyn Mercer? She said. Yes, Evelyn said. My name is Ruth Conaway. I ranch the Broken Sea, 12 miles north of here. She looked at the assembled hands with an expression that seemed to be calculating something. I heard you'd taken on a new man. Quiet type. Came in from nowhere. That's not a secret, Evelyn said carefully. No, Ruth Conaway said. What's a secret is why it might matter to me. She looked at Evelyn directly. Can we talk inside? They sat at the kitchen table and Luce made coffee without being asked, which was so unusual that Evelyn registered it as its own kind of signal. Ruth Conaway put both hands around her cup and said, Crow's been working on me for 8 months. Different angle than with you. My water comes from creek rights, not a spring. And he's been fencing land along the upper creek above me and claiming the fencing moved the property line. She took a sip. I've got 2 neighbors who are in the same position. Harmon Wells to the east, Ed Pittman west of him. Neither of them will talk about it out loud, but I know. Evelyn set her coffee down. How many? At least 6 operations he's squeezing simultaneously, Ruth said. He does it slow and separate, so none of us know the others are being pressed. Makes each person feel like they're alone in it. She looked at Evelyn steadily. Are you alone in it? Less than I was a week ago, Evelyn said. I heard you went to town. I heard you went to Marsh. Ruth's eyes were measuring. Word gets around, even when people think it doesn't. Crow's people heard too. I'd be surprised if they hadn't. Ruth set down her cup. I'm not here to ask you for help. I'm here to offer it. If what you found in that land office covers more than your own property, then it covers mine and Wells and Pittman too, and we've all got a reason to stand behind it. The kitchen was quiet. It might cover more than that, Evelyn said. Ruth looked at her. How much more? I don't know yet. The man who rode to Garrison this morning will know more when he gets back. Who'd you send? Evelyn considered how much to say. A man named Rowan Hale. He has surveyor's field notes and a sworn statement and copies of a forged document that shows Crow's people altered territorial land records. Ruth Conaway was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the window. Hale, she said, almost to herself. You know the name? Ruth looked up. There was a man they used to call the Ghost of Black Mesa, she said. I heard stories when I first came to the territory. Mostly from men who'd been in the kind of situations where a name like that comes up. She paused. Story goes, he cleaned up 3 separate outlaw operations in 2 years in the Southern Territory. Never left innocent people hurt, just appeared, did what needed doing, and vanished again. She looked at Evelyn carefully. Nobody knew his name for certain. I never made the connection until now. Evelyn heard the words, and they didn't surprise her the way they might have a week ago, which told her something about how her understanding of Rowan Hale had been quietly rearranging itself since that first night in Daniel's office. He's a ranch hand, she said. He's working for $15 a month. Is that what you think he is? Ruth said. Evelyn thought about the flour sack map, the wire in the creek bed, the way he'd read the forged resurvey document with steady hands, the way Grant Hollow had looked at the barn door and come away slightly less certain than he'd arrived. I think, she said, that he is exactly what he's decided to be, and that's different from what he's been. Ruth studied her for a moment. Then she nodded, one clean nod, as if that answer had told her what she needed to know. I'll come back with Wells and Pittman, she said, pushing her chair back. Give me 2 days. Can you hold 2 days? I've been holding 11 months, Evelyn said. Ruth almost smiled. It was the same almost smile Rowan had offered that morning, the recognition kind, and Evelyn was starting to understand that it was one of the highest things certain people offered. Bet. He came back the following evening, as promised, and he came back with something she hadn't expected, a federal marshal. The marshal's name was Cord Devereaux, a tall, dry-voiced man from Santa Fe with a badge that was real and eyes that had the permanent slight squint of someone who had spent years outdoors looking at things carefully. He rode alongside Rowan with the easy manner of a man who'd made a decision and was comfortable with it. Aldous Webb, the land commissioner in Garrison, had looked at the field notes and the forged resurvey and the sworn statement from Kettle and had said approximately 4 words before calling for Devereaux, who had been in Garrison on an unrelated matter and who had apparently been building a file on Malcolm Crow's land operations for some time with insufficient evidence. We've had reports from 3 counties, Devereaux told Evelyn in the parlor, where she'd laid everything on the table in a careful order. Original deed, original survey, forged resurvey, Kettle's field notes, his sworn statement. What you have here fills gaps we've been missing for 2 years. She watched him look at the documents with professional attention. Is it enough? She asked. For investigation, more than enough. He looked up. For prosecution, that depends on what we find when we open the land office records. There will be more. There always is with operations like this. This kind of scheme requires multiple points of corruption. You pull one thread, the rest follow. How long does investigation take? Devereaux looked at her with a patience that was practiced but genuine. Longer than you'd like, he said, and in the meantime, Crow's still operating. Yes, but he'll know something's changed by tomorrow. And men like Crow, when they know the law is looking at them directly, they don't usually escalate. He paused. Usually. She looked at Rowan, who was standing against the far wall, and he gave her the small specific look that meant this is what we have, so let's use it. There's more, she said, and she told Devereaux about Ruth Conaway and the other ranchers, about the pattern of separate pressures, about the scale of what Crow's operation appeared to cover. Devereaux wrote in a small notebook and asked precise questions. At the end he said, I'd like to speak with Conaway and the others. I've sent word, Evelyn said. They're coming day after tomorrow. He looked at her. You organized this before I arrived. I organized it before I knew you were coming, she said. Planning for the possibility seemed more productive than hoping for the certainty. Something moved in the marshal's dry, weathered face. Not surprise, amusement, real amusement, briefly and honestly expressed. Mr. Hale said you were a practical woman, he said. She looked at Rowan. He was studying the floorboards with great interest. Mr. Hale, she said, talks more when I'm not around. Button. Devereaux stayed the night because it was late and 40 miles back to Garrison was too much in the dark, and in the morning he rode out to do the preliminary work he needed to do before the meeting 2 days out. Thomas watched him go from the water tower and then came down and said, Federal Marshal. Yes, Evelyn said. Crow's going to hear about that by noon. I know. Thomas chewed the inside of his cheek. That speeds things up on his end. I know that too. He looked at her with those stone-steady eyes. How much time do we have? She looked at Rowan, who had come around the corner of the barn. He'd heard the exchange. He answered Thomas directly. Less than we had yesterday. Thomas nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer. He went back up the water tower. The night Devereaux spent in Garrison on the way back must have been the night someone told Crow. Either that, or one of Hollow's watchers had been closer to Red Hook than they'd planned and had seen the badge. Either way, the sequence of what happened next moved fast. The way things move fast when a plan that has been building slowly suddenly finds its deadline. Rowan came to find her late the second afternoon, 2 hours before the light failed. She was at the spring. She'd made a habit of going there when she needed to think, partly for the practical comfort of cold water, and partly because it felt like the right place to be clear-headed about what she was protecting. He came up the path without announcing himself and stood a few feet away looking at the basin. Hollow came through town today, he said. She turned. Who told you? Josephine. She sent word with a rider this morning. He crouched at the edge of the basin and looked at the water coming up, that clear, cold upwelling from deep in the mountain. He had 8 men with him, supplies. He wasn't provisioning for a day trip. 8 men was more than what watching from a ridge required. Tonight, she said. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow before dawn. He looked up at her. We're not going to have enough warning time. The wire lines will work, but they're not. They were designed to slow, not stop. She looked at him. His face in the late light was tired in the specific way of a man who had been running on something other than sleep for several days and knew it wasn't sustainable, but who had not yet reached the point of letting that change what he did. She recognized it because she'd been seeing the same thing in the mirror every morning. What do you need? She said. I need you to ride to Ruth Conaway tonight, he said. Not wait for the meeting. Go now, tonight, and bring her back here if she'll come. Her and whoever else is willing. She stared at him. You want more people on the property. I want witnesses, he said. When this breaks open, and it will break open probably tonight or tomorrow, I want it witnessed by more people than just ours. Crow's lawyers will work on Thomas and Caleb and Lou's, A dozen ranchers who came because of what they knew and saw it themselves, that's harder to argue against. Ruth said 2 days. We don't have 2 days. He stood up. I know it's asking you to ride 12 miles in the dark. I know the road, she said. I've ridden it plenty. He looked at her for a moment. Take Luce with you. I need Luce here. Evelyn. He said her name plainly, first time in the week she'd known him, and the plainness of it stopped her. Take Luce. Thomas and Caleb and I can hold this through the night. You bring whoever will come. That's more useful than one more rifle in the yard. She thought about arguing and knew she wouldn't win. I'll be back before dawn, she said. I know, he said. Not I hope or try to be, just I know, steady as the spring water. She went down the path. The ride to Ruth Conaway's ranch in the dark was 12 miles of hard road and one creek crossing that was higher than expected from recent rain upstream, and Luce rode it without complaint at a pace that covered ground efficiently without risking a horse in the dark. He said perhaps 3 words the whole ride. She was glad of it. Ruth Conaway opened her door at the knock like a woman who had been sitting up waiting for something to happen, which might have been coincidence and might not have been. Tonight, Evelyn said before Ruth could speak. Ruth looked at her and then at Luce behind her and then at the dark beyond them. How many is he bringing? She said. 8 riders, confirmed, possibly more. Ruth turned around and called into the house. Sam. A man came out of the back room, her husband, lean and weathered, who said nothing but went directly for his coat. Harmon Wells is 3 miles east, Ruth told Evelyn. I've got a fast horse. Give me 20 minutes. We don't have much more than that, Evelyn said. Then you'd better come inside while I get ready. Wells arrived in 40 minutes, with his foreman alongside him, a compact, silent man who looked at the situation and simply checked his ammunition without being asked anything. Ed Pittman, it turned out, was harder to rouse because his ranch hand knocked at the wrong window first and wasted time, but eventually 5 additional riders were on the road south toward the Mercer Ranch, riding fast through a darkness that was by then thoroughly settled around them. Evelyn pushed her horse harder than she liked pushing any horse, and the road came back under them, and the stars were clear above the dry country, and she thought about Daniel, who had ridden this road in the early years when they were still learning the land, who had said once that the territory felt most like itself at night, when you couldn't see all the things men had done to it. She thought about Rowan standing at the water tower in the cold, reading the darkness the way he read everything, carefully, without telling you what he saw until he was sure of it. She thought about tin cans rattling against the barn wall. She pushed the horse harder. They were a quarter mile from the ranch gate when they heard it, not the tin cans, which were too small to carry that far, but voices. Men's voices, more than one, and the particular kind of movement that a group of horses makes when they've been reined in and are waiting. The waiting kind. Luce put his hand up and they all stopped. The night was quiet enough that she could hear the creak of saddle leather. They're at the gate, Luce said, barely above a whisper. Not through it yet. Why are they waiting? Wells asked, behind her. She knew why. Rowan had mapped 3 approaches, and a commander worth his training would want all 3 in position before the first moved. They were waiting for the other 2 groups to signal. There's a signal coming, she said, keeping her voice low. When they get it, they move. We have minutes. Can we go around? Ruth asked. South fence, Luce said. 1/2 mile. Caleb cut a gap for cattle movement. It's still there. She looked at the dark ahead. The voices were still holding. Go, she said. Now, fast and quiet until we're through the fence, then as loud as you want. They went south at a canter, trusting the horse's night vision more than their own, and Luce found the fence gap as if he'd been born knowing where it was, and they went through single file into the south pasture. And then, from the north side of the ranch, 3 things happened nearly simultaneously. The tin cans went off, a sudden bright rattle that split the night cleanly. A rifle fired from the water tower, 1 shot, and Grant Hollow's voice carried across the yard in a shout that had too much surprise in it for a man who'd planned to be the one doing the surprising. Evelyn spurred her horse toward the yard. What she came into was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd expected. Some part of her had prepared for chaos, for men on horses firing in all directions, for the kind of violence that ended things permanently. What she found instead was something stranger and more specific. Rowan was standing in the open yard, not behind cover, not in a defensive position. Standing in the open center of the yard, between the barn and the main house, in the light of the watchfire that Thomas had built up before the attack, which threw everything into sharp amber and shadow. 11 mounted men had come through the gate and fanned into the yard and stopped. They'd stopped because of how he was standing. She couldn't explain it more precisely than that, looking at it from the south fence as she rode through. It wasn't a threatening posture. He wasn't drawing, wasn't crouching, wasn't pointing a weapon. He was just standing there the way a man stands when he's entirely certain of something, and whatever that certainty communicated had hit the 11 riders like a wall. Grant Hollow was at the front, on a gray horse, and he was staring at Rowan with an expression that Evelyn could see even from 40 yards away, because it was an expression that took up a man's whole face, the kind that pushes everything else out. Recognition. Not the recognition of a man seeing someone he knew. The recognition of a man seeing something he'd heard about, something that lived in the category of stories people told carefully in low voices about what happened to operations that went against certain people. "Hail," Hollow said, and his voice had a texture in it that wasn't there when he'd been on her porch making threats. "Rowan Hale." "Grant," Rowan said, like they were two men meeting on a street in ordinary circumstances. "The Ghost of Black Mesa," Hollow said, saying it out loud, naming it, like a man who needed to hear the name in the air to believe what his eyes were telling him. "I haven't used that name in a while," Rowan said. "People put too much story around it." "You cleared out the Dunmore gang in a single night," Hollow said. 14 men. 11, Rowan said. "People always round up." Behind Hollow, the riders had gone very still. She could see it even in the dark. The specific stillness of men who have just recalculated a situation and found the numbers different than expected. Thomas was on the water tower with a rifle. Caleb was at the barn door with another. And now, from the south, 11 more riders had come into the edge of the watchfire light. Ruth and Wells and Pittman and their people, sitting their horses quietly at the fence line, making no move but being very visible. Hollow saw them. He looked at the witnesses. He looked at the water tower. He looked at his 11 men and calculated what they were seeing and what they were worth against what was in front of them. He looked at Rowan. "Who sent for you?" he said. "Who knew to send for you?" "Nobody sent for me," Rowan said. "I came on my own." "Why?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Daniel Mercer saved my life," he said, 7 years ago. "He didn't ask what I'd done or who I was. He just helped." He paused. "I heard he died in a riding accident. I think you know better than I do how much of an accident it was." The yard was silent. The watchfire crackled. Hollow's jaw was tight. He was calculating. She could see him calculating. And she could see the moment he reached the answer because his shoulders changed, dropped slightly from the rigid line they'd been holding. Not defeat. Something more complicated than defeat. The recognition of a position that had no good moves left in it. "The federal marshal already has the documents," Rowan said. "The field notes, the forged resurvey, Kettle's statement. Devereaux's been in garrison since yesterday, and his office in Santa Fe received copies this afternoon by telegraph." Hollow said nothing. "What happens next," Rowan said, "depends on what you do in the next 60 seconds. If you ride out of this yard right now, that's one thing. If you don't, it's another thing, and every man here rides into the morning with whatever that costs him." The silence stretched. One of the riders behind Hollow, not Hollow, a younger man on a sorrel horse near the back, turned his horse quietly and walked it back through the gate. Then a second man did the same, then 2 more. Hollow watched them go. He didn't call them back. He looked at Rowan for a long moment. His face was hard and controlled, and beneath that there was something that wasn't controlled at all, something that had no outlet except the next decision he made. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," Rowan said. Hollow turned his horse. The remaining riders fell in behind him, and they went back through the open gate, and the sound of them moved down the north road and gradually separated from the silence until it was gone. Evelyn sat on her horse at the edge of the watchfire light and felt the adrenaline begin to leave her body, which it did all at once, like water out of a hole, leaving her hand slightly unsteady on the reins and her breathing loud in her own ears. Ruth Conaway rode up beside her. She was looking at Rowan, who was still standing in the center of the yard, not moving yet, like a man who was giving himself a moment before the moment ended. "The Ghost of Black Mesa," Ruth said quietly. "He's a ranch hand," Evelyn said, "working for 15 a month." Ruth looked at her. "Is that still what you think?" Evelyn watched Rowan finally move, turn, look up at Thomas in the water tower, exchange a nod that confirmed something between them. Then he looked across the yard toward the south fence line, toward the riders who'd come in the dark when she'd asked them, toward Evelyn herself. In the watchfire light, he looked tired, genuinely tired, the kind that accumulated over weeks of short sleep and sustained alertness, the kind that didn't go away with one night's rest. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down long enough to take a breath. "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that I know exactly what he is and that it's more complicated than a name." Ruth said nothing to that. The watchfire burned. Caleb appeared from the barn door and Luce came in from the south pasture and Thomas came down from the tower. And the yard that had been held by 4 people against 11 began to fill with the cautious, exhausted relief that follows a thing that could have gone very differently. But the night wasn't quite finished yet, and Hollow's last words were still in the air, and Evelyn knew, the way she'd known about Daniel's accident, the way she'd known the open gate was a threat, that a man like Grant Hollow didn't make a promise like that and then go home to bed. Whatever was finished tonight, something else was still moving toward them through the dark, and it would show its face when it chose to, and not a moment before. Nobody slept much that night. They tried. Ruth Conaway's people bedded down in the barn on what hay could be cleared. Wells and his foreman took the bunkhouse floor. Caleb finally crashed somewhere around 2 in the morning, sitting upright against the barn wall with his rifle across his knees. But the ranch stayed half awake the way a person stays half awake, when their body knows the danger hasn't fully passed, waking at small sounds, listening, settling back down without quite settling. Rowan didn't sleep at all. Evelyn knew because she didn't sleep either, and from the kitchen window she could see the watchfire and the shape of him moving around the perimeter at intervals. Not pacing, not restless, just checking, the way a man checks a thing he's responsible for because that's the work, and the work doesn't care what hour it is. She made coffee around 4 and brought a cup out to him. He was at the north fence line, looking down the road where Hollow's men had gone, and he took the cup without turning around. "He's not coming back tonight," Evelyn said. "No," Rowan agreed, "but he went somewhere." Crow's property is 20 miles north. That's one place he could have gone. He turned the cup in his hands. "The other is the county seat." She looked at him. "Why the county seat?" "Because Crow's been running this through legal channels as much as through riders. If Hollow told him we have federal attention now, Crow's next move might be the law. Or what he owns of it. Try to get an injunction, something that slows down Webb's investigation, something that puts the question of the documents back into the hands of a judge he can influence." He drank. "It would buy him time." "Can he do that?" "He's done it before. There are 2 county judges in this territory who have benefited professionally from Crow's goodwill. Webb operates out of federal jurisdiction, so they can't touch him directly, but they can create enough procedural noise to slow things down while Crow moves his assets and covers his tracks." She thought about that. The cold was settling into the hour before dawn the way it did this time of year, a dry, serious cold that felt like the land reminding you it was still in charge. "What do we do?" she said. "We don't wait for him to make that move first," Rowan said. He handed her back the empty cup. "I need to send a telegraph to Webb first thing this morning. Tell him to expect a legal challenge and to move on the land office records before a county judge can interfere. The telegraph office opens at 7. Then I need to be in Red Hook by 7. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and in the pre-dawn gray he looked very much like what he was. A tired man who had committed to something and was going to see it through regardless of what it cost him personally, not because he was exceptional, but because he'd made a decision, and he was the kind of person who held to decisions. "I'll go," she said. "Evelyn, you haven't slept. I can ride to Red Hook and send a telegraph. You know what needs to be in it. Write it down for me." She held out the empty cup. "And I'll need more coffee before I go." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd stopped being able to categorize. Not quite argument, not quite agreement, something that moved between the two and eventually settled where the practical reality was. "I'll write it," he said. "Gwaseb." She was in Red Hook by 6:45 and at the telegraph office when Emmett Dre unlocked the door at 7, still pulling his coat straight. Dre was a thin, nervous man who'd operated the telegraph office for 11 years and who had, in that time, developed the professional habit of not reading what he sent, which was either integrity or self-preservation, and she'd never been certain which. She handed him Rowan's message and he tapped it out without reading it, and handed her the paper back and said, "Response to come to the ranch?" "To the ranch," she said. "Please send someone if it comes before noon." She was back at the gate before 8, and the ranch had woken up fully in her absence. Ruth's people were moving around the yard. Wells was talking to Thomas at the fence line with the particular posture of two men comparing notes on something practical, and the smell of breakfast was coming from the kitchen where someone had taken initiative with the bacon and eggs she kept in the cold box. Rowan was at the barn with his horse, and for a bad second she thought he was saddling up to leave, but he was just checking the animal's left foreleg, which had shown a slight favor coming in the night before. "Webb's message?" he said, looking up. "Sent," she said. "Dre will send a rider if the response comes before noon." He nodded and straightened up and looked toward the main house. "Your guests are making themselves at home." "Good," she said. "They should. They're invested in this as much as I am now." "Wells wants to talk about combining resources on the Garrett water issue while he's here," Rowan said, with the faint tone of a man who finds the timing of practical negotiations slightly absurd. "Then he can talk about it," she said. "This is what neighboring looks like when it actually works." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about after." She hadn't framed it that way, but she recognized the accuracy of it when he said it. Yes. She'd been thinking about after, the spring, the valley. What the water rights meant not just to her survival, but to every operation within reach of them. She'd been thinking about it since the first night with Amos Kettle at her kitchen table, maybe since before that. "Someone's going to control that spring," she said. "I'd rather it be someone who uses it like Daniel would have." Rowan said nothing, but something in his face acknowledged that he understood exactly what she meant. The response from Webb came before noon, delivered by a boy on a fast horse who handed the envelope to Thomas at the gate and turned around immediately. Thomas brought it to Evelyn without opening it, which she appreciated. Webb's reply was short and typically direct for a man who billed by the word, "Records accessed this morning before county interference attempted." Injunction filed by County Judge Elias Brody denied on federal grounds. 2 additional surveyors altered records identified. Calvert County material connected. Devereaux en route to Red Hook with full federal warrant. Expect arrival by end of week. She read it twice and then read it out loud to Rowan, who was sitting across from her at the kitchen table, and then to Ruth Conaway, who had come in for the reading. "Calvert County," Ruth said. "That's north of here. 2 operations I know of up there that have been having trouble for the past year." "It's bigger than we thought," Evelyn said. "It's exactly as big as it needed to be for the risk to make sense," Rowan said. "A man like Crow doesn't build this kind of apparatus for one spring. He was building toward controlling water access across multiple counties, which means the investment in officials and surveyors and forged documents was spread across a large enough area that no single piece of it looked like what the whole thing was." Wells had come into the kitchen at some point during the reading and was standing in the doorway. "That's why none of us knew about each other," he said. "He was running parallel pressure on a dozen properties and keeping each target isolated." "Until now," Ruth said. "Until now," Wells agreed. There was a quiet in the kitchen that was different from the earlier quiet. Not the quiet of threat and waiting, but the quiet of something shifting in the right direction. The cautious, almost disbelieving quiet of people who have been fighting uphill and have just found their feet on level ground for the first time. Evelyn let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to take one full breath. Then she said, "Devereaux arriving at the end of the week gives Crow 4 days. What does he do with 4 days?" Nobody answered immediately. "He runs," Caleb said from somewhere behind Wells. "Or he fights," Thomas said. Rowan looked at the message in Evelyn's hand. "He's done one specific thing in every situation I've ever seen like this," he said. "When the legal move fails and the physical move fails, A man with Crow's resources tries to make the problem disappear. Not the ranch, not the documents. He paused. The person holding them. The kitchen went quiet in a different way. He'd come after you, Ruth said, looking at Evelyn. He'd come after the most visible problem, Rowan said, which is the person who gathered the evidence, brought in the federal witness, and organized the neighboring ranchers. He looked at Evelyn directly. You need to not be alone for the next 4 days. I'm not alone, she said. I have a yard full of people. I mean specifically alone. Not go for a ride without someone. Not walk to the spring by yourself. He said it without drama, just as fact. Crow's not Grant Hollow. He doesn't ride in with 11 men and make a statement. He's a businessman. He solves problems quietly. She understood what he was saying, and she didn't like it, and she accepted it because it was the sensible thing. All right, she said. He seemed slightly surprised that she'd agreed without more resistance. She noticed that and stored it for later. What none of them had calculated on was Hollow making a separate move from Crow. It came out 2 days later, not through violence, but through Josephine Aldred, who sent her husband Ned at a near gallop to the ranch with a piece of information she'd come by through the particular mechanism of being a woman who ran the only general store in 30 miles and therefore heard everything worth hearing. Grant Hollow had been in Red Hook that morning, not with riders, alone. He'd gone to the sheriff's office, Pruitt's office, and come out after 40 minutes, and the man who'd seen this was a freight driver named Arlo, who did regular business at the Aldred store and who had no particular affiliation with anyone involved. What Arlo couldn't hear was what had been said between Hollow and Pruitt. But Josephine had a theory, which she'd sent along with Ned, and which Ned delivered with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man passing along someone else's speculation. She thinks Hollow's cutting loose from Crow, Ned said. She thinks the federal warrant scared him, and he's trying to make a deal with Pruitt to give up Crow's operation in exchange for some kind of consideration. Rowan was very still when he heard that. Why Pruitt? Evelyn said. Pruitt's useless. Pruitt's local, Rowan said, thinking out loud. A county deal won't survive federal investigation, but Hollow might not know that. Or he might know it and be trying to create confusion, get two parallel processes running at the same time, county versus federal, muddy the water long enough for something to shake loose in his favor. Or, Wells said, he's genuinely scared and he's making a bad decision because that's what scared men do. That's also possible, Rowan said. Which is it? Evelyn asked. He looked at her. I don't know. Which is the problem? Thomas, who had been listening from the doorway with his arms crossed, said, What does it change? If Hollow's making a deal, it changes what he's likely to do physically, Rowan said. A man trying to negotiate his way out of a legal problem doesn't attack a ranch, so that makes his position worse. But a man who's panicking and making bad decisions is unpredictable. So we still watch, Thomas said. We still watch, Rowan agreed. Thomas went back outside. Evelyn looked at the message from Josephine, sitting in pieces on the table from where Ned had assembled it from memory. She thought about Hollow's face in the yard that night, the recognition, the calculation, the decision to leave. He wasn't a stupid man. He was a violent man who was also capable of calculation, which was a specific and dangerous combination. Can you find out, she said to Rowan, what he offered Pruitt? Maybe, he said. I know someone who knows Pruitt's office clerk, but going into Red Hook right now carries its own risk. Send Luce, she said. Nobody looks twice at Luce. Rowan looked at her. She looked back at him. You have thought of everything, he said, and this time it wasn't quite an observation. There was something warmer in it than that. I've had a lot of practice thinking, she said, under difficult conditions. Luce came back from Red Hook that evening with a confirmation and a complication. The confirmation: Hollow had offered Pruitt a written account of Crow's land scheme in exchange for a county immunity arrangement, which was legally worthless in the face of federal investigation, but which Pruitt had apparently accepted anyway, because Pruitt was the kind of man who collected arrangements without examining their durability. The complication? Crow knew about it. How Crow knew was less clear. Either he had someone in Pruitt's office, which was likely given his prior investment in county officials, or Hollow had been less discreet about the meeting than he'd intended. Either way, the result was the same. Crow had cut Hollow loose. Not formally, not with any conversation that anyone witnessed, but in the specific way a man of Crow's type cuts someone loose, by withdrawing the riders who'd been stationed at his northern property and reassigning them in a direction that nobody could account for. "He's moving men," Rowan said when Luce delivered this last part. "Where?" Evelyn said. "Luce doesn't know. Nobody knows." Luce had described it simply. The riders gone, the property quiet. A foreman who'd worked Crow's northern operation for 6 years seen loading a personal wagon in town that afternoon. "He's pulling back," Wells said. "He's repositioning," Rowan said, and the difference in those two words carried weight. Pulling back is surrender. Repositioning is choosing different ground. The evening light was going, and the kitchen was full of people. Ruth, Wells, Thomas, Caleb, and the crowdedness of it that had seemed slightly chaotic 3 days ago had settled into something that felt more like what it actually was. A coalition. Imperfect, assembled under pressure, full of people with their own specific concerns that didn't perfectly align with each other. But here, in the same room, working from the same information. Evelyn looked around the table at all of them and thought, Daniel would have loved this. Not the crisis. Daniel would have hated the crisis. He was not a man who found conflict exhilarating, but this. People in the kitchen, the problem being worked on together, the valley taking care of itself the way a valley was supposed to. She put that thought away and said, "We need someone at the eastern approach tonight. Crow's moved his men in an unknown direction, and the eastern approach is the one we haven't seen used yet." "I'll take it," Wells's foreman said from the corner of the room. He'd said perhaps 15 words total in 3 days, and this was a significant contribution. "Thank you," she said. "Thomas and Caleb on the usual positions. Luce, can you ride the south fence line through the night?" "Yes," Luce said. She looked at Rowan. "I'll be in the yard," he said. She looked at Ruth. "Your people?" "We're staying," Ruth said simply. "As long as needed." The third night was the long one. Not because anything happened, nothing happened, which was in its own way more exhausting than action, because waiting without information required a specific sustained effort. That action didn't. Action used the body. Waiting ate at the mind. Rowan came to the porch at midnight and sat on the steps, and Evelyn was already there, which had become a pattern without being decided on. She'd started bringing 2 cups of coffee at some point, and she handed him one, and they sat in the dark with the stars overhead and the fire in the yard burning low. "I've been trying to work out where I'd go," he said after a while. "If I were Crow. And if I'd built what he's built and it was coming down, I'd try to take the one piece of it that had the most value and hold it somewhere federal jurisdiction couldn't reach immediately." He looked out at the dark. "The spring." She was quiet. "Not the property," he said. "He can't take the property. That's permanent record, and the federal case makes any transfer unenforceable. But if he could physically control the spring, post men there, control access, create a physical dispute that takes longer to resolve through courts than a paper dispute, he slows everything down. The injunction he tried for through the county judge was the legal version of the same play. The physical version would be taking the position and forcing the argument. "Can he do that?" she said. "He'd need enough men to hold the position against what I could bring to the eastern slope," Rowan said. He pulled his riders from the north. If they went east... He stopped. She heard it at the same time he did. Not close, not immediate, but coming up the eastern approach road, the sound of horses moving at a walk, more than 2. The deliberate quiet pace of a group trying not to make noise, which paradoxically made a noise that was distinct from regular night sounds, once you knew to listen for it. Rowan was on his feet before she'd finished standing, not running, moving fast but measured, toward the barn. "Wake Thomas," he said over his shoulder. "Get Wells's foreman." She went, and the ranch that had been holding its breath woke up fast. What followed was not a battle, exactly. The word battle implied 2 sides meeting in force and fighting for a defined objective. What happened on the eastern approach road that night was more like a conversation with guns present that nobody ultimately wanted to use. Crow had sent 8 men to the eastern slope, approaching the path to the spring. They hadn't expected to find anyone already on that approach, which was their mistake. Wells's foreman had gone out there 2 hours earlier and positioned himself quietly above the first bend in the trail. He'd come back down the minute he heard them, which bought Rowan perhaps 10 minutes of preparation time. By the time Crow's 8 men made the gate at the base of the eastern slope, there were 7 people already there. Not 8 of Crow's caliber. Wells's foreman and 2 of Ruth's ranch hands had range experience, not fighting experience. But they were there. And they were armed, and critically, standing among them in the light of 2 raised lanterns was Marshal Cord Devereaux. He'd arrived at 9 that evening, a day earlier than expected, quietly enough that only Evelyn had known. She'd been debating how to deploy that information, and the Eastern approach had just made the decision for her. Devereaux had a federal warrant in his coat pocket and a deputy she hadn't previously seen standing to his left. And when the 8 riders pulled up at the gate and found this particular welcome, the lead rider, not Crow himself, who was not the kind of man who led his own charges, held his hand up and the column stopped. "This is private property under active federal investigation," Devereaux said, in the conversational tone of a man accustomed to making announcements that changed rooms. "Anyone found on this property without the owner's invitation is subject to immediate detention. I'd like to give you a moment to consider that before you make a decision you can't walk back from." The lead rider, a man Evelyn didn't recognize, not one of Hollow's usual crew, looked at the lanterns, at the deputy, at the collection of armed people behind the marshal. He looked at the warrant Devereaux was holding up, which he probably couldn't read in the dark, but which had the shape and the official appearance of something that mattered. He turned his horse, and the column followed him back down the road. Nobody fired a shot. Devereaux lowered the warrant and said, matter-of-factly, "I'd estimate Crow is 3 miles back on that road. Whether he follows his men or keeps going north is his business now." "What about Hollow?" Evelyn asked. "Hollow turned himself into my office in Garrison this afternoon," Devereaux said. "Came in on his own with a written account of Crow's operation going back 6 years. It's thorough." He paused. "He's not a good man, but he's a practical one." She stood on the eastern slope at midnight with a federal warrant in the air and 8 riders going back the way they came, and the spring was above them on the hill, still coming out of the mountain cold and indifferent to everything happening around it, and she thought, it's over. And then, because she'd learned not to trust that feeling until it had been proven. Almost. Malcolm Crow was taken into federal custody 4 days later. Not at his ranch. He'd already left the main property when Devereaux moved on it, which suggested either good intelligence about the timing or simple survival instinct. He was found in a town called Bright Fork, 40 miles east, checking into a hotel under his own name, which was either extraordinary confidence or the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 30 years being the biggest presence in every room and had forgotten that there were rooms his name didn't protect him in anymore. Devereaux sent word to the ranch on a Thursday morning, and Evelyn read the message sitting at Daniel's desk with the spring sunlight coming through the window and the papers of Daniel's careful filing system spread around her where she'd been working through what needed to be submitted to Webb's office as supporting documentation. She read it twice. Then she put it down on the desk and put her hand flat on Daniel's papers and stayed like that for a minute. Crow in custody. The county land office under investigation. Elias Caldwell had resigned 2 days earlier, which was the specific kind of resignation that happens when a man knows what's coming and is trying to get ahead of it. 2 county surveyors had already been interviewed by federal agents. The forged resurvey document, the field notes, and Kettle's sworn statement were formally entered into federal record, and all claims against the Mercer water rights had been suspended pending investigation, with the expectation of full dismissal within 30 days. The words full dismissal sat on the page, and she looked at them until they meant what they meant. Thomas was in the yard when she came out. He looked at her face and he said, "It's done?" "It's done," she said. He nodded. He picked up the fence post tool he'd set down when she came out the door and went back to the work he'd been doing. She found Rowan in the barn. He was sitting on a hay bale with a piece of tack in his hands that he'd been working on, and he looked up when she came in, and she handed him the message without saying anything, and he read it. He was quiet for a long time after. "Crow's lawyers will work on his behalf for years," he said finally. "The investigation will go on longer than the 30 days they're estimating. Wells and the others will have their own fights with the county records." He looked up. "It's not clean." "No," she agreed, "but it's real." He looked down at the message again. She watched him read it a second time, more slowly. like a man making sure he wasn't making the mistake of believing something that was going to hurt him later. Daniel would have wanted to know every detail, he said, half to himself. He'd have read this and asked 6 questions and then made coffee. She laughed, briefly and honestly, which surprised her. It surprised him too. She saw it in his face, the slight recalibration of a man who wasn't used to being the cause of laughter. He would have, she said, and then he'd have gone out to look at the spring. She turned and walked out of the barn, and she heard him get up from the hay bale and follow her, and they walked across the yard and up the eastern slope path without saying anything, and stood at the lip of the stone basin where the water came up cold and clear from deep in the mountain, and the spring was the same as it had always been, and would be the same long after everything that had happened around it was settled and recorded and filed and argued over and finally put to rest. Ruth Conaway came up the path behind them a few minutes later, with Wells and his foreman, and then Thomas, and even Caleb, all of them making their way up to the spring in the late afternoon light, the way people move toward the thing they've been protecting when the protection is finally no longer the only reason to be there. Nobody said anything particularly significant. That was its own kind of meaning. The things that needed saying had been said in harder moments, in kitchens and barn doors and courthouse wires, and a yard lit by a watchfire with riders standing still because they'd met something they hadn't calculated for. What was left was this: cold water, clear sky, people standing on land that was going to stay what it was, and the work, which was always the next thing. Evelyn looked at the spring and thought about what Daniel had said the first time he'd found it, the words Rowan had quoted back to her from a 7-year-old memory. A valley that loses its ranches loses its soul. She thought, they almost lost it. They came close, closer than any of them would have liked, and what had stopped it wasn't any one extraordinary thing. It was Amos Kettle keeping field notes in his coat pocket. It was Josephine Aldred knowing what rope purchases meant. It was Ruth Conaway riding 12 miles in the dark because she'd decided that isolation was the actual enemy. It was Thomas on the water tower, and Caleb scared but staying, and Luce who cleaned his rifle twice, and never explained why he'd stayed all these years when easier employment was available. And it was a quiet man in the corner of the Crescent Saloon who had been carrying a debt for 7 years and finally found the door it belonged behind. She didn't say any of that, she just looked at the water. Behind her, Rowan was looking at it too, and whatever he was thinking, he was keeping it in the same interior room where he kept most things. That place that had been closed a long time and had opened, she suspected, not because anything dramatic had forced it open, but because the gradual, sustained weight of ordinary trust was the one thing that kind of door responded to. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the spring caught the last light of it, and the valley below them lay open and ordinary, and entirely worth the fighting it had taken to keep it. The 30 days Webb had estimated stretched into 6 weeks, which anyone with experience in federal investigations could have predicted, and which Devereaux had in fact predicted, quietly, to Evelyn on the morning he'd left the ranch after Crow's riders turned back from the eastern slope. Legal processes moved at their own pace and didn't particularly care what the people waiting on them needed. What those 6 weeks looked like, practically, was paperwork. Evelyn had not anticipated how much of winning looked like sitting at Daniel's desk filling out federal documentation forms, statements of ownership history, affidavits regarding the forged resurvey, timelines of events from the first threatening letter through Crow's arrest. Webb's office sent requests for supporting material on a schedule that seemed designed by someone who had never personally managed a working cattle operation simultaneously, and she answered each one as completely and quickly as she could, while also making sure the ranch didn't fall apart in the meantime. The cattle still needed moving between pastures. The south fence still had sections that needed proper repair, not the deliberate half-mending they'd left during the worst of it. The smokehouse needed a new door hinge that she'd been putting off since October. The ledger that hadn't added up in 8 months needed to be rebuilt from honest numbers now that she could think clearly enough to do it. Life, she discovered, did not wait respectfully for legal resolution. It kept its own schedule. Rowan stayed. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't announced it. One morning, the threat was functionally over, and he simply kept working, which was the kind of answer that didn't require words and was better for it. He fixed the south fence properly, He helped Caleb repair the water trough in the east pasture that had been leaking since August. He rode the property line with Thomas twice a week, not because anyone was watching from the ridge anymore, but because the habit of knowing the land was a good one that didn't need a crisis to justify it. Thomas had adjusted to him completely by then, in the specific way Thomas adjusted to things, without announcement, without ceremony. Just a gradual recalibration of how much space he left in a conversation for another voice. Caleb had adjusted faster and more visibly in the way young men attach themselves to people they've decided are worth learning from, with an intensity that was sometimes useful and sometimes slightly exhausting. "He's been following you around all morning," Evelyn told Rowan one afternoon when Caleb had gone in for lunch. "I know," Rowan said. "Does it bother you?" He considered that. "He asks good questions," he said, "when he's not asking too many of them at once." "What kind of questions?" "About positioning, about reading ground, about—" He stopped. "About what I did before." She looked at him. "What do you tell him?" Enough to answer the question without answering more than the question. She thought about that. "Is that what you do with everyone?" He looked back at her steadily. "Not everyone," he said, and left it there, which was its own kind of answer. Shots. Ishasat. Amos Kettle had gone back to Mineral Springs after signing the federal deposition, but he wrote a letter 2 weeks later, addressed to Evelyn in the careful handwriting of a man who'd spent decades making precise notations and carried the habit into everything. He thanked her for the coffee, which he said had been the best he'd had in 3 years. He said his daughter had been worried when he'd left, but had seemed proud when he came back. He said he'd slept better in the 2 weeks since the deposition than he had in the 6 years before it, and that he hadn't known how much of his sleep the carrying of it had cost him until he put it down. She read the letter at the kitchen table and thought about what it meant to carry something for 6 years. The particular weight of a wrongness you know about and can't fix, that sits in you like a stone you can't put down and can't throw far enough to stop seeing. She'd been carrying Daniel's death that way. Not grief, exactly. Grief was something else. Grief moved and changed shape, and sometimes went quiet for whole hours at a time. What she'd been carrying was the knowledge that it hadn't been an accident, that someone had made a specific decision, and that decision had cost her the person she'd built her life alongside, and that the people responsible had simply continued existing in the world, doing business, sending threatening letters, buying rope cheerfully at the general store. That stone was gone now. Not because anything brought Daniel back, nothing in the world did that, and she'd long since stopped spending energy on wishing it could. But because the thing that had been done to him was in federal record, was being answered for, and the land he'd loved and the water he'd found and the valley he'd believed in were still what they were and going to stay that way. She wrote back to Kettle, told him the coffee would be waiting any time he made the 40 miles south, and that the valley owed him more than a cup of it. Ruth Conaway came by the second week of November with news from the north. 2 of the ranches that Crow had been pressuring in Calvert County had received formal notices from Webb's office that all contested land claims against them were suspended pending the outcome of the federal investigation, and that preliminary review indicated the claims would be found invalid. A third operation, run by a family named Beaumont, who'd been on the verge of selling out at a loss, had received the same notice and had, according to Ruth, thrown a dinner for 30 people to celebrate. Beaumont's wife cried, Ruth said, sitting at Evelyn's kitchen table with her second cup of coffee. Which I understand completely, because I spent a considerable portion of October doing the same thing in private. I didn't know you were that close to the edge, Evelyn said. Nobody advertises it, Ruth said. That's the thing. You keep going because you have to keep going, and you put the terrified part somewhere they don't show, and eventually either it resolves or it doesn't. She turned the cup in her hands. This time it resolved. This time, Evelyn agreed. Ruth looked at her. That man of yours is planning to leave. Evelyn kept her face even. He's not mine. I know what I said, Ruth replied without any particular emphasis. There was a silence that neither of them filled, which was the conversational equivalent of both of them understanding something without needing to say it out loud. He thinks men like him don't belong in peaceful places, Evelyn said finally. It wasn't a direct answer to what Ruth had said, and it was also a complete one. Ruth looked out the window at the yard, where Rowan was repairing the gate latch that had been stiff since September. Does he think he's still that man? The ghost of Black Mesa? I don't know what he thinks he is, Evelyn said. I know what he's been here for these past weeks. What's he been? She thought about it honestly. Useful, she said. Present? Someone who did the work without needing the work to make him feel important. She paused. Daniel was like that, not in the same way. Daniel was quieter, less, she searched for the word, less shaped by hard things. But that quality of just being where you're needed and doing what needs doing without requiring it to be about yourself, that's rare. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Men who've been through hard things sometimes can't come back from them, she said. And sometimes they can, and they just need a reason. I know, Evelyn said. Do you want him to stay? Evelyn looked out the window at the gate latch being repaired, at the steady, particular way Rowan worked, not fast, not performing efficiency, just methodical and complete. What I want, she said, is for him to want to stay because he's decided it's worth staying for, not because I've asked him to or because he feels he owes something to Daniel's memory. She turned back to Ruth. I won't be something a man stays for out of debt. Ruth studied her. No, she said. I don't think you would be. Bien. Webb's formal ruling came on a Tuesday in late November, and it came in the form of a thick envelope from the Federal Land Commission's Santa Fe office that Emmett Dre held carefully at arm's length when Evelyn came to the telegraph office, as if it contained something that might go off. She didn't open it in town. She rode home with it in her coat pocket, went into Daniel's office, sat at his desk, and opened it there, in the room where they'd first spread out the forged resurvey by lamplight and understood what had been done. The language was formal and dry, which was what legal language was, and she'd gotten practiced enough at reading it in the past 6 weeks that she moved through it efficiently. The water rights claim under the 1879 resurvey was ruled invalid in full, on the grounds of documented forgery by County Surveyor Elias Caldwell in conspiracy with Malcolm Crowe, acting through the firm of Hargrove, Keel, and Associates. The original 1874 survey records, confirmed by licensed surveyor Amos Kettle's sworn testimony and field notes, were reinstated as the governing documentation for the Mercer property. All water rights pertaining to the Eastern Quarter Spring were confirmed as belonging fully and without contest to the estate of Daniel Mercer, in current ownership of Evelyn Mercer. There were 4 more pages of supporting findings, cross-references to the broader investigation, and a note from Webb himself at the end. 1 paragraph, not formal, the only handwritten section in the document. Mrs. Mercer, the investigation into Crowe's broader operation is ongoing and will take considerable time to complete. What you provided was the foundation on which everything else was built. In my 20 years in federal land administration, I have rarely seen a private individual manage evidence under this kind of pressure, this carefully. The Valley is fortunate. She read that paragraph twice and then set it down carefully on Daniel's desk alongside the original 1874 survey, where the 2 documents sat together in the late November light, one old and one new, both saying the same thing in different languages. She put her hand flat on the desk. She didn't cry. She'd cried in October, in private, more than once, in the specific way you cry when you've been holding something too tight for too long and your hands finally open. What she felt now was different, quieter and cleaner, and more closely related to the feeling of ground under your feet than the feeling of water rushing over you. She sat there for a while. Then she got up and went to find Rowan. Tarak. He was at the spring. She should have guessed. She'd told him about Daniel's habit of going there to think. And somewhere in the past weeks he'd developed the same habit, which she'd noticed without remarking on. She came up the path and handed him the ruling without preamble. He read it standing at the edge of the basin with the cold water behind him and the afternoon sky going its late autumn colors above the ridge. He read it all, including Webb's note. He was quiet for a long time after. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said, "completely done." "As done as these things get," he said, "which is most of the way." She almost smiled at that. It was exactly the right qualification. Not deflating the moment, just keeping it honest, because they were both people who'd learned that complete and clean were ideals that real situations approached but didn't always reach. And that was all right. That was just the nature of real things. I got a letter from Devereaux yesterday, she said. I didn't mention it because I was waiting for the ruling first. He looked up. Crow's trial date is set for March, she said. Devereaux expects a full conviction on the fraud charges, potentially more depending on what the investigation into Daniel's death produces. That last part sat between them. She'd said it plainly because it deserved to be said plainly. Daniel's death was still an open thread, still being pulled carefully by federal investigators who were working through 6 years of Crow's operation, looking for the specific moment and the specific order. It might produce a charge, and it might not. Evidence from 11 months ago, in an isolated location, filtered through a county infrastructure that had been actively maintained by the man being investigated. It was not certain. She'd made her peace with uncertain. It had taken time and it wasn't complete, but she'd gotten to a place where she understood that what she could prove was already in the record, and what she couldn't prove might still come to light through the larger investigation. And either way, Daniel's land was his land, and his spring was his spring, and the valley was going to be what he'd wanted it to be. That was not nothing. In fact, it was almost everything. I know it might not be enough, she said. On the question of how he died. I know, Rowan said. I've thought about whether I should... She stopped. Whether I should want more than what the law can give me. Whether that's the right feeling to have. He looked at her carefully. And I think wanting justice and wanting revenge are different things. And I think the honest version of what I want is justice. And I think justice sometimes costs you the full satisfaction of revenge, and that's a trait I can live with. She looked at the spring. Daniel wouldn't have wanted me spending the rest of my life burning over it. No, Rowan said. He wouldn't have. How do you know? You only knew him briefly. He looked at the water. Because a man who saves someone else's life without asking for anything in return is not a man who wants the people he loves making a fire out of his death. He paused. He'd have wanted you to use the spring. She stood with that for a moment, and it settled into a true thing, the kind that lands quietly and stays. I'm going to, she said. That's something I've been thinking about. He waited. Ruth's operation and Wells and Pittman, they all run on creek water that's vulnerable in a drought year. I've been looking at the survey maps, and there are 3 routes where pipelines could run from the eastern quarter and reach all 3 properties without unreasonable cost. She turned to look at him. Daniel did it informally, before. 2 ranches running on goodwill handshake agreements. I want to formalize it. Legal easements, fair agreements, a cooperative structure that survives whatever happens to any individual owner. He was quiet, looking at her. The particular quiet of someone thinking, not someone waiting for a turn to speak. That's a significant amount of legal and physical work, he said. Yes, she agreed. I'm going to need people I trust to help me do it. The words sat in the air between them for a moment, specific and not accidental, and he heard the specific thing in them because he was a man who listened carefully. Is that an offer? He said. It's an honest statement of the situation, she said. What you do with it is your business. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was going the way it went in November, fast and decisive, and the spring was its constant cold self behind him, and the ridge above them held the sky up the way it had always held it. I've been thinking about leaving, he said. I know. I usually leave, he said. It's been the pattern. A place gets settled and I move on to the next unsettled one. He looked at the basin. It made sense for a long time. I'm not sure it makes the same sense now. Why not? He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be genuine rather than performed. Because leaving is easy, he said. And I've been doing the easy thing and calling it freedom for a while now. He turned back to look at her. And because whatever this is, he gestured vaguely at the ranch below them, the valley beyond, the project she'd just described. I want to see how it turns out. She didn't say anything immediate. She let it be what it was, not a declaration, not a promise, not the kind of cinematic announcement that wrapped things up neatly, Just a tired man being honest about what he wanted, which was a more valuable thing than any grand gesture she could have asked for. "Then stay," she said. "Not because of Daniel, not because of a debt." "I know why," he said. "Tell me," she said, because she wanted to hear it in words once from him so that she knew they were operating from the same understanding. He looked at her directly. "Because this place is worth it," he said, "and because you are." He paused. "And because I'm tired of being the ghost of Black Mesa, and I'd like to just be a man who does useful work for a while." She looked at him for a moment, at his face in the failing light, at the tiredness in it that was real, and the steadiness that was also real, both things true at the same time, which was the only honest way for a person to be. 15 a month, she said. "Same terms." He almost laughed, close enough to count. "Same terms," he agreed. December came in cold and clear, which was good for the cattle and good for the pipeline project, which Evelyn had begun laying out on paper in the evenings. Maps and cost calculations and draft easement language that she'd send to a lawyer in Santa Fe whom Devereaux had recommended, a woman named Clara Voss who'd done federal land work for years, and who wrote back within a week with specific, useful questions rather than vague qualifications. Ruth came to 2 planning meetings. Wells came to one and sent his foreman to the other with a list of questions that were so practical and specific that she'd felt a particular gratitude for men who took things seriously. Ed Pittman sent a letter saying he was interested but needed to see formal documentation before he committed to anything, which was a completely reasonable position and which she respected. Amos Kettle sent another letter, this one with a rough sketch of his 1874 field notations that he thought might be useful for the pipeline planning because the original survey had noted potential underground water channels that hadn't been relevant to anything at the time but might be now. She added the sketch to the project folder and wrote back, telling him that if he ever wanted to come south and walk the property with her, she'd value his eyes on it. 3 weeks later, he showed up at the gate on a Wednesday morning on his bay horse, field notebook in his coat pocket, saying he happened to be passing through on his way to visit his daughter again, which Mineral Springs, being 60 miles in the opposite direction, made a flexible interpretation of the word passing, but which nobody mentioned. He spent 4 days. He walked the eastern quarter with Rowan, and the two of them had conversations that Evelyn caught pieces of, technical, precise, about water movement and elevation and soil composition. And the old surveyor seemed lighter on his feet than he'd been when he'd arrived the first time, as if returning to work he understood was its own kind of medicine. On his last evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, he said to Evelyn, "Your husband had the right idea about this spring, but I think your idea is larger." "His idea was right for what he could do," she said. "I'm trying to do what the situation allows now that it's different." Kettle nodded. "He'd have gotten there," he said. "Given time." A pause. "He was a careful man." She heard those words in Rowan's voice first, the way he'd said them in Daniel's office by lamplight, and then in Kettle's voice now, and they landed differently this time. Not as loss, but as description. Not what Daniel had been and was no longer, but what he was, permanently, in the record of things. A careful man. The careful man who'd found the spring and kept the field notes and believed the valley could take care of its own, if the people in it were willing to act accordingly. She thought, he wasn't wrong. He just didn't get to see it. That was grief's particular cruelty, and also its particular truth. The people who plant things don't always live to sit in the shade, but the things they plant still grow. The water still came up cold from the mountain. The valley was still there. January brought the first formal signatures on the cooperative water agreement. Ruth Conaway first, then Wells, and eventually Pittman, after Clara Voss had produced a document tight enough to satisfy even his considerable caution. The easements were filed with Webb's office rather than the county land office, which was a practical decision given that the county land office was still under investigation and would be for some time yet. Elias Caldwell had been formally charged in December. 2 of Crow's associated surveyors had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges, and the information they'd provided had connected Crow's operation to land seizures in 4 counties over 9 years. The scale of it, when Devereaux laid it out in a letter to Evelyn in January, was larger than even their worst guess had been. Crow's trial in March ended with convictions on 12 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of corruption of public officials, and 1 count of conspiracy in connection with the circumstances of Daniel Mercer's death. Not murder, not with the evidence available, but conspiracy, which was what the investigators could prove, and which carried its own weight under territorial law. Devereaux wrote to tell her the verdict on a Thursday. She read the letter in the kitchen with Thomas across the table because he'd asked to be present when it came, and she read it out loud to him, all of it, and when she finished there was a silence. Conspiracy, Thomas said. It's what they could prove, she said. It's not enough. No, she said. It's not what he deserves. But it's what the evidence built, and the evidence was built honestly. She set the letter down. He'll spend the rest of his life knowing the whole territory knows what he did. That's not nothing. Thomas was quiet. He'd known Daniel longer than she had. They'd worked together for nearly a decade before Evelyn had even come into the picture, and Thomas carried that in a private and specific way that didn't look like grief from the outside because Thomas didn't let most things look like anything from the outside. It's not nothing, he agreed finally. He got up and went outside. She sat with the letter for a while longer. She thought about what she'd told Rowan at the spring, that justice and revenge were different, and she'd chosen justice, and that choice cost you something. It did. She was paying it now, sitting in the kitchen with a verdict that was true and real and still fell short of what her chest wanted to do with the fact of Daniel's death. She paid it. And then she folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer behind Daniel's survey records, where the evidence of what had been done and what had been answered for could sit together, and she went to find Rowan. He was in the north pasture, moving cattle to the better grass that came up early in that corner every spring. She could see him from the ridge, him and Caleb and Luz working a section of the herd with the efficient, wordless coordination of people who'd been working together long enough that they didn't need to explain what they were doing to each other. She watched from the ridge for a few minutes. The March light was sharp, and the air still had winter in it, but the ground smelled different. The particular smell of land beginning to wake up, the one that had meant something to her since childhood, and that she'd never found words adequate to describe. She thought about what this place had looked like 11 months ago when Crow had ridden his horse into her yard and dropped his offer in the dirt and left the gate open behind him. The specific particular fear of that moment, not panic, nothing so acute, just the slow, cold knowledge that she was outgunned and outmanned and that the thing she was trying to hold on to was the size of everything she had left. And then she thought about what it looked like now. Rowan moving cattle in the north pasture. Thomas on his usual rounds. Caleb, who'd grown something in the past months that wasn't quite maturity yet but was pointing in that direction. Luce, who'd never explained why he stayed and never would, which she'd come to understand as its own kind of loyalty that didn't require explanation. Ruth Conaway, and her husband Sam, who came to supper twice a month now, and who had become, without anyone deciding this would happen, something close to family. Wells, who had shaken her hand when the water agreement was signed with the careful grip of a man who understood what a handshake meant. Kettle's sketch on his project folder. Devereaux's letters. Clara Voss's clean legal language. The spring coming up cold from the mountain, as it always had. None of it had happened cleanly. None of it had happened without cost. She'd lost sleep, and she'd ridden 12 miles in the dark, and she'd sat with a lamp in Daniel's office turning forged documents in the quiet, and she'd been afraid more times than she could count, a sustained low fear that was different from dramatic terror, the kind that lives in the body like a tightened wire and runs down you slowly over months. And Daniel was still dead. That hadn't changed and wouldn't change, and she'd stopped expecting the resolution of external events to resolve the internal fact of his absence. What she'd learned, in the way you learn things by living them rather than being told them, was that grief and forward motion weren't opposites. You carried one in you while you did the other. The carrying didn't stop you, and the moving didn't dishonor the carrying. She went down the ridge and into the north pasture. Rowan saw her coming and worked his horse over to the edge of the herd and waited. Verdict came, she said. He read her face. Conspiracy, she said, and 12 counts of fraud. He was quiet. It's what there was to prove, she said. I know. He looked at the cattle moving in the afternoon light. How are you? The question was direct and he meant it, which was its own thing. Not, are you all right? The standard formulation that most people used when they wanted to be kind but didn't actually want an honest answer. Just, "How are you?" "I'm working on it," she said, which was also honest. He nodded. He understood working on it as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one, and he didn't try to fix it with anything, which was exactly right. They rode back toward the ranch yard together, not talking, the cattle moving behind them and the spring above them on the eastern slope, and the valley stretching out in the March light, wide and still and fully, imperfectly, actually theirs. There's something people get wrong about survival stories. They think the point is the survival itself. The dramatic moment when the thing that was trying to destroy you fails, when the riders turn their horses and go back the way they came, when the federal ruling arrives in a thick envelope and says the right words in the right order. That moment matters. It's real. But it's not the point. The point is what you do with the ground underneath you once you know it's going to hold. Evelyn Mercer spent the next year building the things she'd described at the spring. Not grandly, not without setbacks, not with any of the smoothness that makes a story feel complete when you're telling it to someone else. The pipeline project took longer than planned because the terrain was harder than the map suggested, and one of the easements required renegotiation when a surveyor discovered a question about the boundary line that needed to be answered before the agreement was legally clean. Pittman backed out in August and then came back in October, which was maddening, and then wasn't, because the version of the agreement he came back to was actually better than the original. Wells's foreman, the compact, silent man who checked his ammunition at midnight without being asked, turned out to be a skilled hand at pipe laying, which was not a talent anyone would have guessed at, and which he offered without ceremony when the work reached his employer's property line. Thomas turned 60 in April and said nothing about it, and Caleb organized a supper that was slightly chaotic, and also the best evening the ranch had seen since before the troubles started. Thomas pretended to be annoyed and wasn't. Luce left in June, not in a bad way, not because anything had gone wrong, but because he had a sister in the South who was ill and needed help, and he came to Evelyn directly and told her plainly, and she told him plainly, that his place was here when he was ready to come back. He nodded and rode south. He came back in September. Amos Kettle came twice more that year. The second time he brought his daughter, who looked at the spring with an engineer's eye and asked questions about flow rate and elevation that nobody had thought to ask, and who left with a set of calculations that turned out to be useful for the pipeline's final design. And Rowan stayed. Not because he'd made a proclamation about it, or because the situation required it, but because he'd said he wanted to see how it turned out, and he was a man who meant what he said. He worked the ranch. He helped with the pipeline project. He rode the property line with Thomas and talked to Caleb about the things Caleb needed to learn, and sat on the porch in the evenings and was present in the particular way that made a place feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. He and Evelyn didn't put words around what they were to each other for a long time, partly because both of them had a deep skepticism of premature language, and partly because what they were was something that built slowly and didn't require naming to be real. It was trust, first. The particular trust that develops between people who've been tested in the same situation and found each other reliable. Then something warmer and more specific, built out of evenings at the kitchen table and mornings at the spring and the thousand small moments of two people working alongside each other and choosing, each day, to keep doing that. The first time he called it home, the ranch, the valley, the place itself, was in a conversation with Ruth Conaway about the pipeline's eastern section, a practical conversation about logistics, and he said it without noticing he'd said it. The way you say a word you've been thinking for a while when the right context finally appears. Evelyn heard it and didn't say anything about it at the time. Later, in the kitchen, after Ruth had gone, she said, "You said home." He looked up from the map he'd been studying. "Earlier," she said, "talking to Ruth." He thought about it. "I did," he said, without qualification. She went back to what she'd been doing, and he went back to the map, and the kitchen held the ordinary sounds of an evening. Fire in the stove, wind at the window, the ranch outside doing what ranches do when the people inside are occupied with other things. What she thought and didn't say, because she was a woman who'd learned the difference between things that needed to be said and things that were simply true. That this is what the spring was for, in the end. Not just the cattle, not just the valley. This. People finding a reason to stay in a place because the place had become worth staying for. Daniel had known that before she could articulate it. He'd said it in the words Rowan had carried for 7 years. A valley that loses its ranches, loses its soul. And she understood now that he hadn't just been talking about economics or agriculture or practical water rights. He'd been talking about the particular thing that happened when people chose, against the pressure of everything that made leaving easier than staying, to put their roots in and hold. Some people never find that thing. Some people find it and lose it and never recover what it felt like. And some people, the ones who are lucky and stubborn and willing to do the unglamorous work that real life requires, find it and build it and protect it and pass it on. The Mercer Spring kept coming up cold from the mountain, as it had always come, as it would come long after everyone who'd fought over it was settled into the earth. The valley held its ranches, and the people in it, imperfect, practical, scarred by the things that had happened to them and still here anyway, went on doing the work. That, in the end, was the whole of it. That was enough.